There's a version of this story you already know. A boy alone in an empty apartment, a headband he hadn't earned yet, a teacher who lied to him, and a truth about a fox that nearly broke him in half. You've seen that night play out before. Naruto Uzumaki, betrayed by the one man he trusted, standing in the forest of death with Mizuki's kunai raised over his head, seconds from dying exactly the way the village always expected him to. But what if that night didn't end the way you remember it? What if the same wound that was supposed to kill him instead cracked open something buried so deep in his blood that not even the third Hokage knew it was still alive? What if the boy everyone called Demon Brat got back up from that killing blow not with fox chakra bleeding through his whiskers, but with something ancient, something golden, something that hadn't been seen in Konoha since the village's own founder walked its streets? Stick around. Because tonight, two bloodlines that were never supposed to meet are about to wake up in the same 12-year-old body. And nothing about this village, this story, or this boy is going to be the same again. Don't forget to hit subscribe and ring that notification bell, because this 10-chapter series is about to take Naruto's power fantasy somewhere the anime never dared to go. Let's get into it. The night air over the training grounds outside Konoha was thick with the smell of damp earth and old pine, the kind of silence that only exists a few hours before dawn, when even the crickets have given up and gone quiet. Naruto Uzumaki lay flat on his back in a small clearing, staring up at a sky smeared with stars, his chest heaving, his whole body aching in that particular way that only comes from stealing a forbidden scroll from the most heavily guarded building in the village. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. The forbidden scroll of sealing sat open beside him, its ancient paper rustling faintly in the breeze, covered edge to edge in techniques that ordinary genin weren't supposed to see for years, maybe ever. Naruto had already burned through 2 failed attempts at the first jutsu on the scroll, sweat pouring down his face, his hands shaking from chakra exhaustion. But he could feel it. He could feel himself getting closer. One more time, he muttered to himself, sitting up and cracking his knuckles. Iruka-sensei's gonna have to pass me now. There's no way he won't. If you know anything about this boy, you know that determination isn't just a personality trait for him, it's practically a bloodline all its own, stubborn to the point of reckless, loud to the point of exhausting, and yet somehow, underneath all of it, achingly desperate to be seen as something other than a mistake the village had to tolerate. He didn't know it yet, but tonight, bloodline was about to mean something very different for Naruto Uzumaki. He just started running through the hand signs for the shadow clone technique again, the same jutsu that had humiliated him at every academy exam for the past year, when a voice cut through the clearing, like a blade. Well, I have to admit, I didn't expect you to actually pull it off. Naruto spun around, kunai already halfway out of his pouch, and found Mizuki standing at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, a strange smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Moonlight caught the edge of his forehead protector, and for just a second, something about the way he was looking at Naruto, like a man sizing up a tool rather than a student, made the hair on the back of Naruto's neck stand up. Mizuki-sensei. Naruto's face broke into a relieved grin, all suspicion gone as fast as it had come. Of course it was fine. Of course. Check it out, I already learned one of the techniques. Does this mean I pass? Iruka-sensei said if I could master something from this scroll. That's exactly what he told you, isn't it? Mizuki's voice was smooth, almost gentle, and that was somehow worse than if he'd been shouting. Naruto, you've done well. Better than I expected, honestly. There's just one more thing you need to do before you graduate. And there it is, the moment where everything in the original story goes sideways. You know what comes next if you've watched this unfold before. The lie about a secret test. The instruction to learn one more technique from the scroll before returning it. Naruto, hungry for approval in a way that made him blind to the obvious trap closing around him, nodding along without a second of doubt. But watch closely this time. Because something is different in the air tonight, and it isn't just the chill. Iruka found them first. Of course he did. He always would. He came crashing through the underbrush like a man who hadn't stopped running since the moment he realized the scroll was missing, his flak jacket half open, breath ragged, and the look on his face when he saw Mizuki standing over Naruto told you everything you needed to know before a single word was spoken. Naruto! Get away from him, now! Huh! Iruka-sensei, what's going on? Mizuki-sensei said if I learned a technique from the scroll, there is no secret test. Iruka's voice cracked with something that sounded almost like grief. Mizuki used you. He's been planning to steal that scroll this entire time, and he needed someone to take the blame for it. Naruto's face went through about 4 different expressions in the space of 2 seconds: confusion, disbelief, the dawning horror of realizing he'd been played, and then, underneath all of it, something older and more tired than any 12-year-old should have to carry. Because this wasn't new, was it? Being used. Being lied to. Being the convenient scapegoat for whatever the adults around him needed him to be that week. Mizuki laughed, low and ugly, and the mask of the kind, patient teacher fell away like it had never been real at all. Iruka, you really are too soft for this village, Mizuki said, rolling his shoulders. Fine. Since the truth's already half out, might as well finish the job. And then he looked at Naruto, really looked at him, the way a hunter looks at something already caught in a trap, and smiled. Hey Naruto. You want to know why everyone in this village hates you? Why they've always looked at you like you're something dangerous, something they wish would just disappear. Mizuki, don't. Iruka's voice was sharp with panic now, real panic, the kind that told Naruto this was about to be something he couldn't take back once he heard it. But Mizuki wasn't going to stop. Men like him never do once they've decided cruelty is the last card they have to play. 12 years ago, the nine-tailed fox attacked this village and killed thousands of people, including the fourth Hokage's own. Mizuki's grin widened. The fourth couldn't kill a being like that, so he sealed it inside a newborn baby. That baby was you, Naruto. You are the nine-tailed fox. You're the monster that murdered half this village. Silence. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat, where every insect and rustling leaf in the forest seems to have gone still out of respect for the wreckage about to happen. Naruto didn't move. Didn't breathe, really, for a long moment. Something in his eyes, that familiar, stubborn, bright-eyed determination that had carried him through every humiliation the Academy had ever handed him, flickered and went dark, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. Like finally, an explanation for a lifetime of averted eyes and slammed doors and whispered conversations that stopped the second he walked into a room. That's... Naruto's voice came out small. That's why. That's why everyone always... Naruto, don't listen to him. Iruka stepped forward, but Mizuki was already reaching for the giant shuriken strapped to his back, and everything happened very, very fast. There's a rule the third Hokage made everyone swear to, Mizuki said, unslinging the weapon with practiced ease. Nobody was allowed to tell you what you really are. Guess I just broke that rule. Might as well break one more. He hurled the shuriken, and Iruka threw himself in front of Naruto without a second's hesitation, taking the blade across the back with a wet, awful sound that made Naruto's whole world tilt sideways. Iruka-sensei! Run, Naruto! Iruka gasped, blood soaking through his jacket, his hands still braced protectively in front of the boy he just nearly died for. Get out of here! But Naruto didn't run. Of course he didn't. This is the part of the story where, canonically, he stays, not out of some grand strategic decision, but because some part of him, some deep and worthless part, refuses to let another person bleed for him without at least trying to do something about it. Mizuki laughed again, readying a second, larger shuriken from his back. Touching. Really. But it changes nothing. That scroll is coming with me, and neither of you is walking away from this clearing. You're not laying a hand on him, Iruka growled, struggling to rise despite the wound in his back. Not while I'm still breathing. Then let's fix that. Mizuki lunged. Here's where you need to lean in a little closer, because this is the moment. This is the exact second where the story you thought you knew splits off into something new. In the timeline you remember, Naruto steps between Mizuki's strike and his teacher, takes the blow through sheer luck and a burst of Nine-Tails chakra, and the fox's power alone is what saves him. A flash of red, a moment of monstrous strength, and then the truth about what's really living inside him settling like a stone in his stomach. Tonight, it starts the exact same way. Naruto throws himself forward without thinking, arms spread, putting his own small body between Mizuki's blade and Iruka's bleeding one. He feels the impact before he processes the pain, a white-hot line of fire tearing across his side, deep enough that even through the adrenaline, some clinical, terrified corner of his brain registers that this is bad, this is really bad, this might actually. And then something happens that has never happened to Naruto Uzumaki before. Something that hasn't happened to anyone in Konoha in longer than most of the village's current shinobi have been alive. The wound doesn't just stop bleeding, it closes. Not with the slow, ordinary crawl of a body healing over days, but instantly, violently, the torn flesh knitting itself back together in front of Mizuki's eyes with a sound like tearing paper plate in reverse. Naruto gasps, more from shock than pain now, because the agony that should have dropped him to his knees is already fading into something distant and strange, replaced by a pressure building behind his sternum like a held breath about to be released. And then his back arches, and something bursts out of him. Two long, glowing golden-orange chains erupt from his spine, whipping out into the clearing with a metallic shriek, wrapping around a nearby tree trunk and snapping it clean in half like it was made of dry kindling. The chains hum with visible chakra, pulsing in time with Naruto's own frantic heartbeat, and for a moment, just a moment, the whole clearing is bathed in a soft, golden light that makes Mizuki stumble backward, his second shuriken forgotten in his hand. What? Mizuki's voice cracks with genuine fear now, all his earlier confidence draining out of him at once. What is that? That's not the fox's chakra, that's not red, what? Iruka, propped against a tree with blood still soaking his jacket, stares at the boy in front of him with an expression that has stopped being about fear entirely and become something closer to reverence, because he recognizes those chains. Not personally. He was barely a genin himself when the Nine-Tails attacked 12 years ago, but he's heard the old stories, the ones the older shinobi tell in hushed voices about Kushina Uzumaki and the golden chakra chains she was famous for, chains that could bind even a tailed beast if she willed it. Naruto. Iruka whispers. Those are Uzumaki chains. And here's the thing, that alone would already be enough to change everything. An Uzumaki bloodline manifestation, thought lost with the destruction of Yuzushiogakure decades ago, awakening in the son of Kushina Uzumaki herself. That, by itself, would be a story worth telling, but it isn't the only thing waking up tonight, because as the chains lash out and coil protectively in front of Naruto's chest, something else stirs, something older, something that has absolutely no business being in an Uzumaki's blood at all. The ground beneath Naruto's feet trembles, and thin tendrils of pale wood bark textured, faintly glowing at the edges, begin to push up through the soil, twisting around his ankles like they're trying to root him in place, like the earth itself has recognized something in him and wants to hold on. Mizuki takes another step back, and this time it's not fear on his face, it's the beginning of genuine, bone-deep terror. Because he's a chunin. He's spent enough years in this village to know exactly what would growing out of the ground in response to a person's chakra means, even if the idea of it happening in front of him, right now, to this boy, feels impossible. That's... Mizuki's grip on his shuriken goes slack. That's would release. That's Mokutan. That's supposed to be extinct. The Senju bloodline died with Hashirama and Tsunade's generation. There's no way. Naruto himself has no idea what's happening. All he knows is that the pain in his side is gone, replaced by a strange, electric warmth spreading through his whole body, and that when he looks down at his own hands, he can see faint traces of chakra, two distinct colors twining together, gold and pale green, pulsing under his skin like something alive and separate from him, finally allowed to breathe after 12 years locked away. Naruto's voice shakes. I don't know what this is. What's happening to me? Iruka, despite his own wound, despite the blood loss making the edges of his vision go soft and gray, forces himself upright, putting a hand on Naruto's shoulder, not to hold him back, but to steady him. Naruto. Listen to me. Whatever this is, he has to stop, breathe through the pain in his back. Whatever this is, it's not the fox. Do you understand me? Look at those chains. Look at that wood. That's not the Nine-Tails chakra. That's yours. That's something that belongs to you. For 12 years, Naruto Uzumaki has been told, in 100 small and large ways, that the thing inside him that makes him different is something to be feared. A monster. A weapon. A mistake sealed away in human skin. And in the space of about 90 seconds, in the middle of a forest clearing at 3 in the morning, bleeding and betrayed and reeling from the worst secret of his life, he's just been handed the opposite. Something that is entirely, unmistakably his. You can watch it happen on his face. The shift from terror to something else. Something that looks, for the first time all night, almost like hope. Mizuki doesn't get the luxury of watching that transformation with any patience. I don't care what bloodline freak show you've got running through your veins, he snarls, hefting his shuriken again, some of his nerve returning now that the light show has settled. You're still just a demon brat who's about to die in the middle of these woods. He charges. And this time, Naruto doesn't hesitate, doesn't freeze, doesn't wait for someone else to save him. The chakra chains snap forward on their own, faster than Naruto consciously directs them, faster than Mizuki can track, and they wrap around his wrist and ankle mid-charge, yanking him off his feet with a violent jerk that sends the shuriken flying uselessly into the underbrush. Mizuki crashes to the ground hard, the air driven out of his lungs in a single ragged grunt, and before he can even try to scramble upright, thin roots of pale would erupt from the ground beneath him, wrapping around his limbs and pinning him flat against the dirt. Naruto stands over him, chest heaving, golden chains still humming faintly in the air behind him, and for a moment neither of them says anything at all. How? Mizuki gasps, straining uselessly against the wood binding his arms. How is this possible? You're supposed to be nothing. You're supposed to be a nobody. I don't know what I am right now, Naruto says, and his voice is quieter than either Mizuki or Iruka expects, not the loud, brash tone the whole academy has grown used to tuning out, but something steadier, older. But I know I'm not gonna let you hurt Iruka-sensei again. It's right about then that the third player in tonight's little drama finally arrives. The third Hokage had felt it the moment the chakra spike hit, a signature so unmistakably, achingly familiar that it had stopped him mid-sentence in the middle of a late-night meeting with two of his advisors, his teacup halfway to his lips, because he'd felt that exact chakra signature once before. 12 years ago, from a woman standing in the middle of a maternity ward with chains erupting from her back, holding a monster at bay with nothing but sheer will and an ocean of red hair. Kushina. He was moving before the thought had even fully formed, Anbu falling into step behind him without needing to be told, robes billowing as he crossed rooftops toward the training grounds faster than a man his age had any right to move. And underneath the shock of that familiar chakra was something else, something that made his old heart pound harder than it had in years. A second signature layered right alongside the first, one that felt like standing in an old-growth forest that had somehow learned to breathe. One that felt, impossibly, unmistakably, like him, like his old friend. Like the man whose face was carved into the mountain above the village he'd spent his whole life trying to protect. It can't be, Hiruzen thought, even as his feet carried him faster. That bloodline died out generations ago. There's no way. There's no possible way. But hope, once it takes root in an old man's chest, is a stubborn thing. By the time he landed at the edge of the clearing, the scene that greeted him was almost enough to stop his heart outright. Iruka, slumped against a tree, bleeding but alive. Mizuki, pinned to the ground by roots of pale wood that had no business existing in this century. And standing in the center of it all, golden chains still faintly glowing where they hovered protectively around him, was Naruto, 12 years old, covered in dirt and sweat and traces of his own blood, staring back at the third Hokage with wide, uncertain blue eyes. For a long moment, Hiruzen Sarutobi simply stood there. Not as the Hokage. Not as the leader of a hidden village with a war room and a council and 100 pressing duties waiting for him back at the tower. Just as an old man, looking at a boy he'd sworn to protect 12 years ago, seeing something in him he genuinely, truly had not expected to see for the rest of his life. Hokage-sama, Iruka managed, struggling to sit up straighter despite his wound. Mizuki, he attacked us, he tried to steal the forbidden scroll, and he told Naruto about. He hesitated, glancing at Naruto, unsure how much the boy wanted said aloud in front of the Anbu now dropping silently into the clearing around them. I know what he told him, Hiruzen said quietly. His eyes hadn't left Naruto. I felt it the moment it happened. Mizuki, still pinned to the ground, let out a strangled, half-hysterical laugh. Hokage-sama, you have to see this, you have to understand what he is. He's got chains, he's got wood, He's some kind of freak, he shouldn't even. Silence. The word came out with no particular heat, but it carried a weight that made even the wood-constraining Mizuki seem to tighten reflexively around him. Hiruzen finally tore his gaze away from Naruto to look down at the man on the ground, and whatever expression crossed the old Hokage's face made Mizuki's protests die in his throat entirely. You stole village secrets. You attacked 2 of my shinobi. And you revealed information under a law that carried the penalty of death for its breaking. You will have plenty of time to explain yourself to Ibiki. I suggest you save your breath. The ANBU moved in, hauling Mizuki up out of the wood restraints, which, at Naruto's shaky, uncertain gesture, slowly retracted back into the earth as though they'd been waiting for permission to let go. 2 of them hauled the traitor away into the dark, his protest fading into the trees, and then it was just Hiruzen, Irika, Naruto, and the very last of the golden light still fading from the chains hovering at Naruto's back. Naruto. Hiruzen crossed the clearing slowly, kneeling down in front of the boy despite his old knees protesting the movement, bringing himself eye level in a way he hadn't done since Naruto was small enough to be carried. Are you hurt? Hi. Naruto looked down at his side, where a wound should have been gaping open, where instead there was only a thin, pale scar already fading into nothing. I don't think so. I got hit, but then it just healed. And then this stuff just started happening and I don't. Old man, what's going on? What is this? There it was. The question Hiruzen had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure for 12 straight years. The moment where the truth he'd been protecting Naruto with, and from, finally demanded to be spoken. He glanced at Irika, still bleeding, still listening with wide, uncertain eyes. This wasn't a conversation meant for an audience, even one as loyal as Irika had proven himself tonight to be. But some truths, once cracked open, can't be neatly resealed. Irika, Hiruzen said gently. You need medical attention. I'll have someone escort you to the hospital. Hokage-sama, please, if this concerns Naruto, I'd like to. You will hear all of it, in time, if Naruto wishes you to. Hiruzen's voice softened, just slightly. Tonight, you've already given more than enough of yourself for this village. Let the medics take care of you. I promise you, this is not the last conversation any of us will have about tonight. Irika hesitated, then nodded, wincing as an ANBU medic helped him to his feet and guided him carefully out of the clearing, throwing one last look over his shoulder at Naruto before the trees swallowed him from view. And then it was just the 2 of them. The old Hokage and the boy who had just become something the entire village had assumed was impossible. Sit down, Naruto, Hiruzen said, lowering himself onto a fallen log with a tired sigh, gesturing to the space beside him. This is going to take a while to explain, and I imagine you have a great many questions. Naruto sat, though every part of him was still humming with leftover adrenaline and the strange, unfamiliar warmth of chakra he hadn't known he possessed until 20 minutes ago. The chains had fully retracted now, vanished back into wherever they'd been hiding his entire life, leaving no physical trace behind except the faint golden shimmer that still seemed to cling, ever so slightly, to his skin. Mizuki said. Naruto started, staring hard at his own hands. He said there's a fox sealed inside me. That I'm the reason my mom and dad, that I'm the reason so many people died 12 years ago. Is that true? Hiruzen closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, there was a weight in his expression that made him look every one of his many years. It is true that the 9-tailed fox is sealed within you, he said slowly, carefully, choosing each word like he was defusing something that could still explode if handled wrong. But you are not the fox, Naruto. You are its jailer. A seal is not the thing it contains, the same way a scroll is not the jutsu written on it. Your father made the ultimate sacrifice to place that seal, believing that his own son would grow to control that burden and one day be seen as a hero for carrying it. He was not wrong to believe that. He was only wrong about how much time it would take this village to see it. Naruto's throat tightened, 100 questions crowding behind his teeth all at once, but the one that came out first surprised even him. My dad? You knew my dad? Hiruzen hesitated. This was not the conversation he had planned to have tonight, was not the order in which he had intended these particular dominoes to fall, but there was no walking it back now. Not after everything else that had already spilled into the open in this clearing tonight. Yes, Naruto, he said quietly. I knew both of your parents very well. And that, he added, gesturing faintly toward Naruto's back, where the chains had so recently been, is the first piece of the second truth I need to tell you tonight. Naruto blinked, some of the raw grief in his expression giving way, for just a moment, to confusion. Second truth? There's more? Those chains you summoned, Hiruzen said, belonged to your mother? Kushina Uzumaki. She was the last known wielder of that particular chakra chain technique in this village, a hallmark ability of her clan, the Uzumaki, who once ruled a hidden village of their own called Uzumaki, before it was destroyed decades ago. Konoha and Uzumaki were bound by an old alliance, sealed by marriage between our clans generations back. Your mother came here as one of the last of her line, and she carried that bloodline in her blood the same way she carried it in her heart, fiercely, and without apology. Naruto stared at his own hands like he was seeing them for the first time, some deep and aching part of him grasping for the shape of a mother he had never known, finding for the first time a piece of her that was undeniably, tangibly real. She was my mom, he whispered. That's really hers? It's yours now, Hiruzen said. As much a part of you as your own name. For a long moment, Naruto simply sat with that, breathing it in, letting something settle in his chest that felt suspiciously, unfamiliarly like pride. And then, because Naruto Uzumaki has never in his life let a loose thread simply lie still, he looked back up at the old man beside him, brow furrowing. Okay, but what about the wood stuff? The chains are mom's. But you said wood release is supposed to be extinct. Where'd that come from? Hiruzen was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Naruto started to fidget, started to wonder if he'd asked something he wasn't supposed to. That, the old Hokage said finally, slowly, choosing his next words with the particular care of a man about to open a door he was not entirely certain he had the authority to open, is a truth I only fully understood myself less than an hour ago, when I felt your chakra spike from clear across the village. There is a scroll, sealed, hidden, left in my care by your parents before you were even born, with instructions that it only be opened under very specific circumstances. Circumstances I hoped, for your sake, would never come to pass. A scroll, Naruto repeated. About the wood thing, about a truth your mother and father discovered together, before you were born, Hiruzen said. A truth about exactly how deep the roots of your mother's family tree actually went. I confess, Naruto, even I did not fully believe it, not until tonight. He rose slowly from the log, brushing off his robes, and extended a hand down to help Naruto to his feet, an old, familiar gesture, the same one he'd used 100 times over the years whenever he found the boy scraped and dirty after some misadventure or another. Come with me, Hiruzen said. It's time you saw exactly what's been waiting for you your entire life. The walk back to the Hokage's tower passed in a strange, heavy silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the village settling toward dawn, a dog barking somewhere in the residential district, the far-off creak of a market stall being set up hours early by some particularly ambitious vendor. Naruto walked half a step behind the third Hokage the entire way, his mind still spinning through everything that had happened in the last hour, replaying the sensation of those chains bursting free of his back, the strange, breathing warmth of wood curling protectively around Mizuki's wrists. He didn't know what he was yet. Not really. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, different didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a door cracking open onto something he hadn't even known he was allowed to want. They passed through the tower's side entrance, avoiding the main halls where a handful of night shift chunin still moved between offices, and climbed a narrow staircase Naruto had never noticed before, tucked behind a bookshelf that Hiruzen slid aside with practiced ease. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, windowless room lined with locked cabinets and old storage scrolls, lit by a single dim lamp that flickered as they entered. Hiruzen crossed to the far wall, running his fingers along a specific section of shelving until he found what he was looking for, a plain wooden box, unremarkable in every way except for the seal etched into its lid, one that pulsed faintly with recognition the moment Naruto stepped close enough. This box has sat in this vault for 12 years. Hiruzen said quietly, lifting it down with careful, reverent hands. Sealed with a lock key to Uzumaki chakra signatures specifically. I have tried to open it myself, more than once, out of simple curiosity in quieter years. It never so much as budged. He turned to look at Naruto, something unreadable in his tired old eyes. I suspect, tonight, that will no longer be the case. He held the box out. Naruto took it with hands that weren't quite steady, feeling the faint hum of the seal against his palms the moment his fingers made contact. A warm, recognizing pulse. Like the box itself had been waiting 12 years for exactly this moment, exactly this touch. The lid clicked open on its own. Inside, resting on a bed of faded cloth, was a single scroll, its edges worn soft with age, tied shut with a cord the same deep red as Kushina's hair had been. And etched into the wax seal holding it closed were two symbols pressed together, side by side, in a way that made even Hiruzen's breath catch when he saw it clearly for the first time in the lamplight. The spiral of the Uzumaki clan, and beside it, unmistakable, the ancient crest of the Senju. Naruto stared down at the scroll in his hands, his heart hammering somewhere up in his throat, and looked up at the third Hokage with wide, uncertain eyes. Old man, what is this? Why does it have? He swallowed hard. Why is the Senju symbol on here? Hiruzen Sarutobi, a man who had led this village through wars, through tragedy, through the death of more students and friends than he cared to count, found himself, for perhaps the first time in decades, entirely without words for what he had to say next. Because the story this scroll was about to tell wasn't just Naruto's story anymore. It was about to become the story of an entire clan the world thought had died out. The very clan whose founder's face was carved 40 feet tall into the cliffside overlooking the village they both called home. Open it, Hiruzen said quietly. And I'll explain everything I know. Naruto's fingers found the edge of the red cord, trembling slightly, and began, very slowly, to pull it loose. Naruto woke up to sunlight streaming directly into his eyes and the distinctly unfamiliar sensation of leaves brushing against his face. Wah! He sat bolt upright, batting at the pale green foliage now draped across half his pillow, and for one disoriented moment genuinely forgot why there was a tree in his apartment before the entire previous night came crashing back into his memory all at once. The scroll. The vault. His mother's handwriting. 2 bloodlines instead of none. Right, he muttered, staring blearily up at the sapling, which had grown considerably overnight, its upper branches now brushing against the ceiling and spreading sideways enough that half his kitchenette was currently obscured behind a curtain of pale leaves. Right, okay. This is a thing that's happening. This is my life now, apparently. He climbed out of bed, picking his way carefully around exposed roots that had cracked clean through his floorboards, and stood there for a long moment just staring at the whole absurd situation with the particular exhausted clarity of someone who has had approximately 3 hours of sleep after the most life-altering night of their entire existence. Okay, he said out loud, mostly to steady his own nerves. Okay. I can fix this. Probably. I stopped it before, right? I can just do that again. He reached out and pressed a hand flat against the trunk, the same way he had in the clearing the night before, and tried to recreate that same instinctive pulse of stop, that's enough, settled down that had worked on Mizuki's restraints. For a moment, nothing happened, and Naruto's stomach dropped with the beginning of real panic, and then, slowly, the faint hum of chakra beneath his palm responded, the tree's growth stilling entirely, its leaves rustling once, and then falling still. Ha! Yes. I did it! Naruto pumped a fist in the air, grinning despite the general absurdity of celebrating a victory over houseplant management. Okay. I can work with this. What he could not work with, unfortunately, was the fact that the tree wasn't going anywhere on its own, and he had exactly one apartment, and he was fairly sure his landlord, who already looked at him like he expected the building to spontaneously combust whenever Naruto was inside it, was not going to be thrilled about the new indoor forest situation. That problem, thankfully, resolved itself faster than Naruto expected. A soft knock at his door around mid-morning turned out to be an ANBU operative, in a plain mask, sent by the Hokage himself with instructions that Naruto was to leave the tree exactly as it was, that a team would come by later that day to assess and stabilize the structural situation, which turned out to mean carefully reinforcing his floor and building a section of wall specifically designed to accommodate his new roommate without the whole building falling down around it. The Hokage says, the ANBU relayed flatly, That involuntary growth of this nature is not unusual for a newly awakened bloodline, and that with practice, you should be able to prevent it from happening again. He would like you to report to the training grounds behind the tower after your academy classes conclude today. Wait, seriously? Today? I've got class in Naruto glanced at the cracked clock on his wall. Okay, I've got class in 20 minutes, I gotta go. Tell the old man I'll be there. He grabbed his jacket, shoved his feet into his sandals, and sprinted out the door, leaving behind an apartment that now permanently smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, and a small forest of curiosity waiting patiently for him to come home. The walk to the academy felt different that morning. Not because anything around him had actually changed. The same market stalls setting up along the main street, the same handful of villagers giving him the same careful, distant looks they always did, but because Naruto himself felt different, in a way he was still trying to figure out how to carry. He wasn't nothing anymore. He wasn't just the loud kid nobody wanted to sit near, the prankster, the demon brat, the empty space where a family was supposed to be. He was an Uzumaki. He was, impossibly, almost unbelievably, a Senju too. He had a mother who'd loved him enough to leave him a piece of herself sealed away for 12 years, waiting for exactly the right moment to reach him. It didn't erase 12 years of loneliness. It didn't undo a single slammed door or averted gaze, but it gave him something to stand on that hadn't been there yesterday, and Naruto Uzumaki, more than almost anyone else in that entire village, understood exactly how much difference having something to hold on to could make. He slid into his seat in the academy classroom just as the bell rang, sweaty and out of breath, and found Sasuke Uchiha already seated a few rows over, arms crossed, staring straight ahead with his usual air of practiced indifference. Except, and Naruto noticed it almost immediately, in the particular way that rivals tend to notice things about each other that nobody else would catch, Sasuke's gaze flicked toward him for just a fraction of a second longer than usual. Assessing. Something had changed, and even without knowing what, some instinctive part of Sasuke Uchiha had already registered it. You're late, Naruto, Sasuke said, not looking at him directly. Yeah, well, you try having a tree grow through your bedroom floor overnight, and see how punctual you are, Naruto shot back, dropping into his seat. Sasuke's brow furrowed slightly, clearly assuming this was just another one of Naruto's nonsensical excuses, and let it go without further comment. Though Naruto caught him glancing over again a few minutes later, something faintly, uncharacteristically curious in his dark eyes. At the front of the room, Iruka stepped through the door, and the entire class went quiet at the sight of him, a fresh bandage visible beneath his collar. His movements just slightly careful in a way that suggested the wound from the night before hadn't fully healed yet, even with medical attention. Iruka-sensei. Sakura's hand shot up immediately, along with half the class. Are you okay? What happened? I'm fine, Iruka said, offering a tired but genuine smile as he made his way to his desk. There was an incident last night involving a stolen village scroll, but it's been resolved, and the person responsible is in custody. I appreciate the concern, but there's nothing for any of you to worry about. His eyes found Naruto's across the room, just for a moment, warm and steady, and carrying an unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them in that clearing the night before. Naruto gave him the smallest of nods back, and something eased slightly in both of their shoulders. Class proceeded largely as normal after that, a review lecture on basic chakra theory that Naruto had heard approximately 1,000 times before and still somehow managed to only half absorb, followed by a break period where most of the class scattered out into the courtyard to eat and socialize before the afternoon's practical exercises. It was during that break that things got interesting. All right, everyone, gather up, Iruka called, standing at the edge of the training field with a clipboard in hand. Since some of you will be taking your graduation exam later this week, I want to run a few practical assessments today. Nothing formal, just a chance to see where everyone stands before the real thing. A ripple of nervous energy went through the assembled genin hopefuls. Naruto felt his own stomach twist slightly, not from the usual anxiety about failing, which had haunted him through every single one of his previous attempts, but from an entirely new and unfamiliar worry. What if something happens? What if I lose control and a tree bursts out of the middle of the training field in front of everyone? We'll start with basic taijutsu sparring, Iruka continued, apparently oblivious to the particular flavor of dread now settling over one specific student in the group. Partners will be assigned. Keep it controlled. This is an assessment, not a competition. Naruto's partner, as luck would have it, turned out to be Kiba Inuzuka, who greeted the pairing with an eager grin and an immediate, "Alright, don't hold back on me, Naruto. Actually, you probably should hold back, 'cause I'm gonna win either way." "You wish," Naruto shot back, some of his usual confidence returning despite the nerves still churning underneath. They squared off in one of the marked sparring circles, and for the first few exchanges, everything proceeded more or less how it always had, Kiba's aggressive, instinct-driven style clashing against Naruto's scrappy, improvisational one, either landing anything particularly decisive. And then Kiba threw a punch that Naruto, without entirely meaning to, caught and redirected using a movement that felt less like his own usual sloppy blocking and more like something ancient and practiced, flowing up through his arm from somewhere he didn't fully understand yet. Kiba stumbled off balance, and Naruto, chasing the opening on pure reflex, felt a familiar warm hum building behind his sternum. No, not here, not now, he managed to catch it. Barely. The chain stayed sealed away, the wood stayed buried beneath the training field's packed dirt, but the sheer effort of suppressing it mid-spar cost him his balance, and Kiba capitalized instantly, sweeping his legs out from under him and pinning him flat with a triumphant whoop. "Ha! Told you I'd win." Yeah, Naruto grumbled, letting Kiba haul him back to his feet, his heart still hammering from the near miss. Iruka, watching from the sidelines, had noticed something, not the full picture, not by a long shot, but enough to file away for later. Naruto's movements in that brief exchange had carried a fluidity, a controlled precision, that simply hadn't been there a week ago. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing that would stand out to anyone who wasn't specifically watching for it. But Iruka had spent enough time carefully, quietly watching this particular student that the change registered immediately. He's adapting to it already, Iruka thought, making a small note on his clipboard while his outward expression stayed carefully neutral. Faster than I would have expected. Good. He's going to need every advantage he can get. The rest of the sparring assessments passed without further incident, Sasuke dominating his own matches with the crisp, controlled efficiency that had made him the top of the class for years running, Sakura holding her own better than she usually gave herself credit for, Hinata quietly, nervously outmaneuvering her partner with technical skill that almost nobody in the class properly appreciated. It was during the final exercise of the day, a basic clone technique demonstration, the same jutsu that had failed Naruto so spectacularly at every previous exam, that things nearly went sideways in a much more visible way. "Alright, last one," Iruka announced. "Standard clone technique. One at a time, please." Naruto's stomach dropped straight through the floor. This was, historically, the single worst part of any academy assessment for him. His chakra reserves were so enormous, so wildly disproportionate to a normal genin's, that the standard clone technique, which required careful, controlled chakra distribution, had never once worked properly for him. He always ended up with some pale, sickly, half-formed wisp of a clone that promptly collapsed the moment anyone looked at it too hard. He watched Sasuke perform a flawless set of clones, watched Sakura and several others manage passable if unremarkable versions, and felt the familiar dread creeping up his throat as his turn approached. "Naruto. Whenever you're ready." He took a breath, ran through the hand signs, and pushed chakra outward exactly the way he always had, and this time, something was different. The chakra that answered his call didn't feel like the same thin, unmanageable flood he was used to fighting against. It felt layered, two distinct currents twining together, one golden fierce, one pale green and steady, and where his chakra control had always been a battle against overwhelming volume, tonight it felt, for the first time in his entire life, like something he might actually be able to shape. 3 clones popped into existence beside him. Not the flickering, half-transparent failures of every previous attempt, solid, stable, indistinguishable from the genuine article, standing in a neat row and grinning at the rest of the stunned classroom with identical expressions. "Dead silence?" "Naruto," Iruka said slowly, staring at the clipboard in his hands like it might offer some explanation for what he just watched. That was an excellent clone technique. "Aye," Naruto blinked at his own clones, equally stunned. I did it? I actually did it? The clones vanished in small puffs of smoke a moment later as Naruto's concentration broke entirely under the sheer surprised joy of the moment, and around him, his classmates had gone quiet in a way that carried a different weight than their usual dismissive indifference toward him. Sakura was staring at him with open confusion, clearly trying to reconcile the boy who'd bombed this exact exercise 100 times before with what she just watched. Kiba let out a low whistle. And Sasuke? Sasuke had gone very still, dark eyes narrowed slightly, watching Naruto with an intensity that had nothing to do with dismissal at all. Something's different about him, Sasuke thought, jaw tightening slightly. That wasn't luck. That was actual control. Where did that come from? Naruto, for his part, was too busy grinning like an idiot and pumping both fists in the air to notice the shift in how the rest of the class was looking at him. The beginning, however small, of something that hadn't existed in that classroom before today. Not quite respect yet, but curiosity. Attention. The first cracks in 12 years of being overlooked. All right, settle down, Iruka said, though he couldn't quite keep the faint, please smile off his own face as he said it. Good work, everyone. That's all for today. Make sure you're rested up before the graduation exam this week. Naruto practically flew across the village toward the training grounds behind the Hokage Tower that afternoon, buoyed by the small, genuine victory of the clone technique and eager, in a way he hadn't quite expected, to actually start understanding the powers that had upended his entire life less than 24 hours earlier. He found the third Hokage waiting for him in a secluded clearing well away from the academy's usual training areas, wearing simple training clothes instead of his ceremonial robes, and somewhat to Naruto's surprise, accompanied by a stack of old, weathered scrolls and a low wooden table that had clearly been set up specifically for this meeting. Old man! I did it! I did the clone technique, actually did it, 3 of them, perfect and everything. So I've heard, Hiruzen said, and the warmth in his voice made it clear the news had already reached him well before Naruto's arrival. One benefit, apparently, of being the most informed man in the village. Iruka sent word directly. I understand it was rather more impressive than your previous attempts. Yeah, well. Naruto rubbed the back of his neck, grinning. Guess having actual chakra control instead of just, like, an ocean of chakra sloshing around uselessly helps. That is, in fact, precisely the point of what we're going to work on today. Hiruzen gestured to the low table and the scrolls arranged across it. Sit. Before we begin any practical exercises, I want to explain what I know, and more importantly, what I don't, about the 2 bloodlines now active within you. Naruto dropped down cross-legged across from him, some of his earlier exuberance settling into genuine focus. Whatever else people said about him, and plenty of people had said plenty of unkind things over the years, nobody could ever claim Naruto Uzumaki didn't take his training seriously once he actually cared about the outcome. Your mother's chakra chains, Hiruzen began, are, from what historical record exists, primarily a defensive and restraining technique. They were famously strong enough that your mother once used them to physically subdue the 9-tailed fox itself, holding a creature capable of leveling mountains in place through sheer chakra-infused chain strength alone. That ability alone would make you an extraordinarily dangerous shinobi even without anything else factored in. And the wood release? Considerably more complicated, Hiruzen admitted. Hashirama Senju's wood release was, by every account from those who witnessed it directly, one of the single most versatile and powerful abilities ever recorded in this village's history. He could grow forests from bare earth in seconds. He tamed and befriended tailed beasts using techniques rooted in that same bloodline. He built the very foundations this village stands on using that power, quite literally, raising the earliest structures of Konoha out of the ground itself. He paused, folding his hands together. I do not know yet how much of that potential exists within you, diluted as it is by generations of intermarriage and deliberate suppression. It's entirely possible your version of the ability is more limited than his was. It's equally possible, given how strongly it manifested last night on its very first activation, that it is not limited at all. Naruto swallowed hard, the weight of that settling over him slowly. So basically, you don't actually know what I'm capable of. No, Hiruzen said honestly. Nobody does. Which is precisely why we are going to proceed carefully, methodically, and with patience, starting today, with the most basic exercise I can devise, simple, controlled chakra release, aimed specifically at teaching your body to distinguish between the two chakra natures now available to you, so that involuntary manifestations like the one currently occupying your apartment become considerably less common. Please tell me there's a way to actually control that, Naruto said. The tree thing, I mean? It's already taking up half my kitchen. Hiruzen's mouth twitched with poorly suppressed amusement. There is. It will take practice, as with any new skill, but yes, control is absolutely achievable, and I suspect, given how quickly you managed to master the clone technique today, you may find this comes to you faster than either of us currently expects. For the next 2 hours, under the fading afternoon light, Naruto worked through a series of exercises that felt almost laughably simple on their surface. Sitting still, breathing steadily, trying to feel the difference between the two distinct chakra signatures now humming beneath his skin, trying to call up the faintest possible trace of each without letting either one spiral out into full, uncontrolled manifestation. It was, in its own way, harder than any taijutsu spa or ninjutsu drill he'd ever attempted. Naruto's entire life had been built around throwing everything he had at a problem as loudly and directly as possible, and this required the opposite. Patience. Subtlety. Listening to something inside himself instead of fighting against it. He failed more times than he succeeded, sending one particularly stubborn attempt spiraling into a small burst of wood that cracked clean through a nearby boulder, and yelping in surprise as a thin chain lashed out unbidden and nearly took Hiruzen's teacup clean off the low table. But by the end of the session, sweat-soaked and exhausted in a way that felt satisfying rather than defeated, Naruto managed something that made even Hiruzen's carefully composed expression crack into open pride: a single, small, deliberate root, no longer than his forearm, rising slowly and precisely from the earth at his direct command, and retreating just as smoothly back into the soil the moment he willed it to stop. There, Hiruzen said quietly. That is control, Naruto. Small, deliberate, and entirely yours. Everything else will build from exactly that foundation. Naruto stared at the small patch of disturbed earth where the root had briefly emerged, grinning despite his exhaustion, something settling into place inside him that felt suspiciously, wonderfully close to confidence. I'm gonna get good at this, he said. Like really good. Good enough that nobody in this whole village is ever gonna look at me like I'm nothing again. Hiruzen studied him for a long moment, the fierce, stubborn set of his jaw, the bright determination in eyes that carried both his mother's spirit and something of his father's quiet resolve, and felt something old and tired in his own chest ease, just slightly, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit. I believe you, the old Hokage said simply. I believe you entirely. Neither of them noticed the faint shift in shadow at the edge of the clearing, a barely perceptible ripple in the tree line, gone again almost before it registered. The kind of presence that only years of dedicated training could achieve. The root operative had been there for the better part of the session, watching in absolute silence from a concealed position, chakra suppressed to the barest possible whisper, recording every detail for the report that would land on Danzo Shimura's desk before the night was through. A single controlled root, the operative thought clinically, cataloging the observation alongside everything else witnessed that afternoon. Deliberate, precise, achieved after roughly 2 hours of guided instruction. Significant control progress for a single training session. The Hokage is investing considerable personal time in this development. By the time Naruto and Hiruzen finally packed up the scrolls and prepared to head their separate ways as evening settled over the village, the operative had already melted back into the deeper shadows of the forest, moving swift and silent toward the district where Danzo would be waiting, patient as always, for whatever new piece of the puzzle tonight's surveillance had provided. Danzo received the report in the same dim, windowless room he seemed to favor for all such business, listening with his single visible eye closed, absorbing every detail without a single interruption until the operative had finished. Controlled root manifestation, achieved through direct guided instruction from the Hokage himself, Danzo repeated slowly, turning the information over with the same careful deliberation he applied to every piece of intelligence that crossed his desk. 2 hours of training, and already demonstrable progress in an ability that took even Hashirama Senju years to properly master as a child. Shall I continue surveillance, Danzo-sama? Yes. Increase the frequency. if it can be done without detection risk. I want reports on every training session, every technique attempted, every measurable increment of progress. Danzo's fingers tapped once against the arm of his chair, a rare visible tell of the calculation running behind his composed expression. The Hokage clearly intends to shape this boy's development entirely according to his own judgment, with no oversight, no counsel involvement, no input from anyone possessing the strategic clarity necessary to properly weigh what is truly at stake here. He rose slowly, moving toward the small shrine of old portraits mounted along one wall of the room, faces of shinobi who had served under him over the decades, some still living, most long since given everything they had to give for the village's sake, in ways the wider public would never fully know or appreciate. Sarutobi believes sentiment can coexist with strategy, Danzo said quietly, almost to himself. He believes a boy can be permitted to grow at his own pace, guided gently, protected from hard truths and harder choices, and still emerge strong enough to shoulder the burden two extinct bloodlines have just placed upon him. He shook his head slowly. It is the same mistake he has made with that child from the very beginning. Kindness alone will not prepare that boy for what is coming, once word of his abilities inevitably spreads beyond this village's walls. And spread it will. Secrets of this magnitude do not remain buried forever. What would you have me do, Danzo-sama? Danzo was quiet for a long moment, considering. For now, nothing beyond continued observation, he said finally. I do not yet have sufficient grounds to move more directly without risking direct confrontation with Hiruzen, and such a confrontation, undertaken prematurely, would accomplish nothing beyond alerting him to precisely how closely I am watching. Patience, as always, will serve our purposes better than haste. He turned back toward the operative, his expression settling back into its usual unreadable stillness. But make no mistake, he added, voice dropping lower, harder. If the day comes when Hiruzen's approach proves insufficient to the threat this development represents, when his sentiment endangers not just the boy, but this entire village's security, I will act. And I will not hesitate the way he so often does. The operative bowed low and vanished back into the darkness, leaving Danzo alone once more with his portraits, his calculations, and the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who believed, with absolute and unshakable conviction, that he alone possessed the clarity necessary to protect a village that didn't fully understand how much protection it truly required. Meanwhile, entirely unaware of the shadow now quietly attached to his every training session, Naruto walked home through the settling dusk with a lightness in his step that had nothing to do with chakra and everything to do with the simple, novel experience of a good day. A day where he'd graduated one step closer to real, and trained with the actual leader of his entire village, and, for the first time he could remember, felt like the strange, overwhelming thing living inside him wasn't a curse at all. He didn't know about Danzo. Didn't know that somewhere across the village, a man with considerably less warmth than Hiruzen Sarutobi had already begun quietly plotting exactly how a Senju Uzumaki bloodline might best serve Konoha's interests. Konoha's interests, in Danzo's mind, being a phrase that conveniently, consistently aligned with whatever Danzo himself had already decided was necessary. He also didn't know, as he pushed open the door to his apartment, and was greeted by the now familiar sight of his indoor tree rustling gently in the evening breeze from his open window, that Sasuke Uchiha had spent the walk home from the academy turning today's events over and over in his own mind, dark eyes narrowed with a particular, focused intensity that boded very poorly for how peacefully this new rivalry was going to develop. Some things, it turns out, don't stay hidden for long. Not in a village built entirely out of shinobi trained to notice exactly the kinds of details other people work hardest to conceal. Naruto hadn't slept much the night before graduation, though for once, it wasn't nerves keeping him awake, or at least, not only nerves. He'd spent a good 2 hours after dinner sitting cross-legged on his apartment floor, practicing the small, deliberate exercises Hiruzen had shown him, coaxing a single thin root up through a crack in his floorboards and then, with steadily improving control, guiding it back down into stillness without so much as a stray leaf sprouting where it shouldn't. His indoor tree, which he'd taken, somewhat affectionately, to calling bushy during one particularly punchy midnight training session, had stopped growing entirely under his careful attention, settling into a permanent, manageable size that the ANBU construction team had reinforced the apartment around rather than trying to remove. Hiruzen had been oddly insistent about that, actually, mentioning something about how a living connection to Naruto's bloodline, kept close and cared for, might help him build an intuitive relationship with his own chakra faster than pure exercise alone. Naruto suspected the old man just thought it was funny watching a genin hopeful negotiate roommate boundaries with a tree, but he wasn't about to argue with results. By the time morning came, he was dressed, fed, and standing outside the academy gates a full 20 minutes before he needed to be, which was, by any measure of Naruto Uzumaki's historical punctuality, nothing short of a miracle. "You're early," came a familiar voice, and Naruto turned to find Iruka approaching, a folder of paperwork tucked under one arm, his old Scarbridge nose crinkling with the particular fond exasperation he reserved almost exclusively for Naruto. "Should I be worried? Ha ha, very funny, sensei." Naruto rolled his eyes, though he couldn't quite keep the grin off his face. I wanted to actually be ready for once. You know. Do this right." Iruka's expression softened, the teasing falling away into something warmer. "You've been doing it right for a while now, Naruto. Today's just the day everyone else finally gets to see it." They walked into the building together, and if you'd asked Naruto a week ago what today would feel like, he probably would have described the same tight, anxious knot he'd carried into every single previous exam attempt. The fear that no matter what he did, it wouldn't be enough, that some new obstacle would materialize specifically to keep him on the outside looking in one more time. Today, that knot simply wasn't there. In its place was something steadier. Something that felt, strange as it was to admit even to himself, a little bit like confidence. The written portion of the exam passed without much drama. Naruto had never been much of a scholar, and he wasn't about to suddenly transform into one overnight just because he'd discovered a secret heritage. But he'd put in genuine effort studying alongside his chakra control exercises over the past few days, and he walked out of that portion of the test reasonably confident he'd cleared the passing threshold, even if he wasn't about to be topping any charts. The practical portion was where things got interesting. The examination room had been set up the same way it always was, a simple, unadorned space with Iruka seated at a small table alongside Mizuki's replacement, a stern-faced Chunin named Ebisu who Naruto vaguely remembered from a handful of substitute lessons over the years, and a short checklist of basic techniques each student would need to demonstrate. "Uzumaki, Naruto," Iruka called, and Naruto stepped forward, rolling his shoulders, very aware of the small cluster of classmates still waiting their turn who'd gathered close enough to watch. Curiosity written plainly across several faces after the clone technique display earlier that week had spread through the grapevine faster than Naruto had expected. "Transformation technique first," Ebisu said, clipboard raised. Naruto performed a flawless transformation into a perfect copy of the Third Hokage, a small, private joke that made Iruka's mouth twitch with suppressed laughter even as Ebisu simply made a neutral checkmark on his clipboard, unaware of exactly how appropriate that particular choice of disguise had become in the last week. Substitution technique. Also flawless, Naruto swapped places with a stray log positioned at the edge of the room in the blink of an eye, a technique he'd actually always been decent at, buried as it usually was under the much larger, much more public disaster of his failed clone attempts. And finally, Ebisu said, glancing down at his clipboard with the faint, resigned air of a man expecting to check a familiar box marked insufficient, clone technique. The room went a little quieter. A handful of Naruto's classmates, who'd already tested, had lingered specifically to watch this part, word having spread that something had changed since last week's practical assessment. Naruto ran through the hand signs, steady and precise, and pushed exactly the right measure of chakra outward, not the overwhelming, uncontrollable flood that had doomed every previous attempt, but something shaped now, layered, gold and pale green twining together beneath his skin exactly the way Hiruzen had taught him to feel for over the past several days. 3 solid, perfect clones popped into existence beside him, standing at identical attention, grinning in unison. Ebisu's pen stopped moving entirely. He looked up from his clipboard, then back down at it, then up again, clearly running through some internal checklist of whether he was somehow misremembering this particular student's academic file. He cleared his throat. "That's an excellent demonstration, Uzumaki. Congratulations. You pass." The words hit Naruto like a physical wave. 12 years of failed attempts, of watching other kids walk out of this exact room with headbands he couldn't earn, of Iruka's kind but increasingly strained encouragement each time the outcome landed the same way. All of it crested and broke at once, and Naruto let out a whoop loud enough that it echoed clean down the hallway outside. Yes! I did it! I actually did it! Iruka rose from his seat, crossed the small distance between them, and, in a gesture that surprised absolutely everyone in the room, including Naruto himself, pulled his old headband from his own forehead and tied it carefully around Naruto's, his hands steady despite the visible emotion in his expression. Congratulations, Naruto, Iruka said quietly, just for him. You've more than earned this. Naruto reached up, fingers brushing the cool metal of the plate now resting against his own forehead, and for a moment, he couldn't say anything at all, throat too tight around a feeling that didn't have an easy name. By the time the graduating class reassembled for the formal announcement of team placements 2 days later, Naruto had worn his new headband every single waking moment, sleeping with it within arm's reach and checking his reflection in every reasonably reflective surface he passed with an enthusiasm that Sakura, seated a few rows ahead of him, found simultaneously endearing and mildly exhausting. He's not going to stop talking about it, is he? She muttered to Ino, who'd wandered over during the pre-announcement chaos specifically to gossip about team placements. Forehead. I don't think he's stopped talking since it happened, Ino said, though there was less of her usual dismissiveness in her tone than there might have been a week earlier. Word of Naruto's sudden, dramatic improvement had traveled fast through their year's rumor mill, and even Ino, who never paid Naruto much mind beyond his general disruptiveness, had clocked that something had genuinely shifted. Iruka called the room to order, and the familiar ritual of team announcements began. Names read aloud, small groups shuffling together, quiet murmurs of relief or disappointment rippling through the room depending on how the pairings landed. Team 7, Iruka read, and Naruto sat up straighter. Uzumaki Naruto. Hareno Sakura. Uchiha Sasuke. Naruto's reaction was, predictably, loud, a fist pumped triumphantly into the air, a grin thrown in Sakura's direction that she pointedly ignored while suppressing her own small, satisfied smile at being paired with Sasuke, and a considerably more measured, unreadable glance from Sasuke himself, who'd already half expected this exact pairing given the Academy's tendency to balance top and bottom performers together on each squad. Except, of course, Naruto Uzumaki hadn't really been the bottom of anything for the better part of a week now, and Sasuke, who had spent that same week quietly, carefully cataloging every unusual detail he noticed about his new teammate, was fairly certain the Academy's placement logic hadn't fully accounted for that fact. Your Jonin instructor, Iruka continued, will be Hatake Kakashi. They waited, and waited, and waited some more, long after every other team had been collected by their respective instructors and filed out of the classroom, until it was just the three of them. Naruto sprawled dramatically across a desk, Sakura pacing with increasingly visible irritation, and Sasuke leaning against the window frame with his usual air of unbothered patience, left alone in an empty classroom for the better part of 2 hours. This is ridiculous, Sakura finally snapped, checking the clock for what had to be the 15th time. What kind of Jonin is late to meet his own team? Probably a bad one, Naruto offered unhelpfully, though even he was starting to feel the sting of impatience creeping in around the edges of his earlier good mood. It was almost exactly then that the door slid open, and a tall, silver-haired man wearing a mask that covered the lower half of his face and a forehead protector tilted at an angle that covered one eye stepped into the room with the placid, unbothered air of someone who genuinely had no concept of how much time had just passed. My first impression of you three, Kakashi said, surveying them each in turn with his single visible eye, is that I hate you. Silence. What? Sakura managed, somewhere between offended and confused. Meet me on the roof, Kakashi said simply, and vanished in a small puff of smoke, leaving the three of them staring at the space where he'd just been standing. Up on the academy rooftop a few minutes later, Kakashi settled onto the low railing with the easy, deliberate looseness of a man who'd clearly performed this exact introduction ritual a fair number of times before. All right, he said. Let's do introductions. Names, likes, dislikes, hobbies, dreams for the future. You first, Pinky. Sakura fumbled through an introduction that ended, predictably, in a shy, giggling glance in Sasuke's direction that made Kakashi's visible eye crease with the particular expression of a man internally sighing. Sasuke, when his turn came, gave a clipped, guarded summary that revealed almost nothing beyond a stated ambition involving restoring my clan and killing a certain man, delivered with a flatness that made even Sakura's earlier enthusiasm falter slightly. And then it was Naruto's turn. "Name's Naruto Uzumaki," he announced, with all his usual volume. "I like ramen, obviously, and training, and I've been getting into this whole, well, it's kind of a long story, but let's just say I've got some new stuff I'm learning about that's pretty cool. I dislike the 3 minutes you have to wait for instant ramen to cook, and people who judge others before actually getting to know them. And my dream," his grin widened, fierce and bright, "is to become Hokage. The strongest one this village has ever seen." Kakashi's single visible eye lingered on him for a moment longer than strictly necessary, a beat of quiet, careful assessment that Naruto, still riding the high of his own enthusiasm, didn't fully register. But it was there, and it meant something, because unlike almost everyone else Naruto had grown up around, Kakashi Hatake had actually read this boy's file in full before today, had seen the notation, buried deep in a heavily restricted section, about a certain seal and a certain nine-tailed burden. Had not, however, because this particular piece of information had been kept even more tightly restricted than the first, read anything at all about chakra chains or wood release. "All right," Kakashi said, filing his curiosity away for later. "Tomorrow, we're going to do a survival exercise. Don't eat breakfast, or you'll throw up. Meet me at Training Ground 7 at dawn." "Wait, that's it?" Sakura asked. "What kind of exercise?" "You'll see," Kakashi said, with the particular tone of a man who found his own cryptic vagueness deeply amusing. "Oh, and just so you know, out of the 28 graduates from this year's class, only 9 are actually going to become genin. The rest get sent back to the academy, so I wouldn't get too attached to that headband just yet." He vanished again in another puff of smoke, leaving all 3 of his brand new, thoroughly unsettled students standing on the rooftop in stunned silence. Dawn the next morning found Team 7 gathered at Training Ground 7, tired and hungry. Sakura had skipped breakfast entirely per Kakashi's instructions. Sasuke had eaten a light meal anyway on the theory that a Jonin's warning probably contained at least some exaggeration, and Naruto, having ignored the warning almost entirely, had wolfed down 2 bowls of instant ramen before leaving his apartment, on the grounds that no test in the world was worth facing on an empty stomach. Kakashi arrived a full hour late, offering a lazy apology about getting lost on the path of life that satisfied absolutely no one, and produced 2 small bells from his pocket, tying them to his belt with deliberate, unhurried movements. "The rules are simple," he said. "You have until noon to take these bells from me. Whoever doesn't get one goes without lunch, and gets tied to that post over there to watch the rest of us eat." He gestured toward 3 weathered wooden stumps a short distance away. "Also, remember what I said yesterday about only some of you passing? This test determines that. Come at me with the intent to kill, or you won't stand a chance." Sakura's face had gone pale. Sasuke's jaw had tightened with focus. Naruto, characteristically, had already dropped into a ready stance, practically vibrating with impatience to just get started. "Ready, begin." All 3 scattered into the surrounding tree line in the span of a heartbeat, exactly as Kakashi expected, except for one small, glaring exception that registered in his peripheral vision almost immediately. Naruto hadn't hidden. He was standing directly in the open clearing, hands on his hips, grinning across the distance at his new sensei with an expression that suggested he'd either completely failed to grasp the basic concept of stealth, or had decided, with characteristic bravado, that stealth simply wasn't going to be necessary. "Hey! You! Silver hair!" Naruto shouted. "Let's just settle this straight up, no hiding, no tricks. I'm gonna get those bells fair and square." Kakashi, despite himself, felt a small flicker of genuine amusement. Bold words for someone who just told me exactly where he's standing. "Yeah, well," Naruto's grin sharpened. "Guess we'll see," he charged. What followed was, from Kakashi's perspective, initially exactly the kind of clumsy, straightforward assault he expected from the class's historically lowest performing student. A wild flurry of punches and kicks, easily read and easily deflected, The kind of attack pattern a jonin of Kakashi's caliber could counter in his sleep, let alone while holding a book in one hand, which he did, in fact, produce partway through the exchange with theatrical nonchalance. And then Naruto's hand shot forward mid-strike, and instead of the expected fist, Kakashi felt something cold and metallic wrapped tight around his wrist. He glanced down, and for one full second Kakashi Hatake, a man who had survived a war, who had faced down S-rank missing nin, who had earned a reputation across the shinobi world as the copy ninja for his sheer breadth of battlefield experience, simply stared, uncomprehending, at the golden chakra chain now coiled around his forearm. What? The second chain came from the opposite direction, catching his other wrist before he could react, and for one brief, genuinely alarming moment, Kakashi Hatake found himself standing in the middle of Training Ground 7 with both arms bound and a 12-year-old boy grinning at him from 6 feet away like he'd just won the lottery. Chakra chains, Kakashi thought, mind racing through every possible explanation even as instinct kicked in, and he substituted himself with a nearby log a half-second later, breaking free of the restraints before Naruto could capitalize further. That's an Uzumaki clan technique. Historical record only, nothing active in decades. How does he? He landed several yards back, expression carefully neutral despite the storm of questions now crowding his thoughts, and found Naruto already grinning at him with a fresh set of chains still humming faintly at his sides. Guess I got your attention, huh? You certainly did, Kakashi said slowly, tucking his book away for the first time, his single visible eye considerably sharper now than it had been 30 seconds earlier. Where exactly did you learn that technique, Naruto? Long story, Naruto said. Kind of a family thing. You gonna fight me for real now, or are we still doing the lazy reading a book bit? Kakashi's mouth curved into something that, behind the mask, might have been the beginning of genuine respect. Alright then. Let's see what else this family of yours taught you. The exchange that followed was considerably more even than either of them had expected going in. Kakashi, now fully engaged, proved more than capable of avoiding the chains through sheer speed and experience, weaving between strikes with the fluid ease of a man who'd faced far more dangerous opponents than an overenthusiastic new genin. But every time he thought he'd fully read Naruto's pattern, something new emerged, a burst of wood erupting from the ground to block his path, forcing him to alter his approach mid-motion, or a chain lashing out from an angle that shouldn't have been physically possible given Naruto's positioning a half-second earlier. It wasn't enough to actually land a hit, not against a jonin of Kakashi's caliber, but it was enough, more than enough, to keep him fully, seriously engaged in a way his other two students, still hiding cautiously in the surrounding tree line, had absolutely no idea was even happening. Eventually, with the sun climbing higher and Naruto's chakra reserves, vast as they were, beginning to show the first signs of strain from sustained, controlled use rather than his usual reckless output, Kakashi called a temporary halt, raising both hands in a gesture of pause. Alright, that's enough for now, he said. We need to talk, and then we're going to regroup with your teammates, because there's rather more to this test than you currently realize. Naruto, breathing hard but grinning fiercely, let the chains retract with visibly improving control. So? Did I pass? That, Kakashi said, is a considerably more complicated question than it was 5 minutes ago. By the time the test concluded, with all three genin hopefuls eventually working together, at Sakura's surprising insistence and Naruto's characteristic stubbornness, to realize the true purpose of the exercise wasn't the bells at all, but teamwork itself, Kakashi Hatake found himself looking at his newly assigned squad with considerably more interest than he'd anticipated, feeling at the start of the day. You pass, he announced, once all three were gathered, dusty and exhausted, in front of him. Those who break the rules are scum, but those who abandon their teammates are worse than scum. You figured that out just in time. Welcome to becoming a genin, officially. Team 7 starts real missions tomorrow. Sakura and Sasuke's relief was immediate and visible. Naruto's was quieter, layered under something that looked, to Kakashi's practiced eye, a great deal like the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent his whole life fighting for exactly this moment, and still couldn't quite believe it had arrived. As the other two headed off, chattering with the loose, giddy energy of kids who just survived something genuinely difficult together, Kakashi held a hand up, catching Naruto before he could follow. A word if you don't mind. Naruto paused, some of his easy grin fading into cautious attentiveness. Yeah, those chains, Kakashi said, once the other two were safely out of earshot. And the wood. I assume there's a reason the Hokage hasn't seen fit to inform your Jonin instructor about a bloodline manifestation this significant before assigning that instructor to a genin team with you on it. Naruto hesitated, weighing how much to say. But something about Kakashi's directness, no judgment in his tone, just genuine, professional curiosity, made the decision easier than expected. It's kind of new, Naruto admitted. Like really new. Happened less than 2 weeks ago. The old man's been keeping it quiet while we figure out how to, manage it properly. Kakashi's single visible eye studied him for a long moment. That would explain a great deal, actually. I'd like to speak with Hokage-sama myself, if you don't mind, not to pry into whatever privacy considerations are at play, but because if I'm going to be responsible for your safety and development as your Jonin instructor, I need to understand exactly what I'm working with. Yeah, that's probably fair, Naruto said. He probably wants to talk to you anyway. Figure out who else needs to know, and stuff. Good. Kakashi's visible eye crinkled slightly, the closest thing to a genuine smile he seemed inclined to offer. For what it's worth, Naruto, that was an impressive display today. More impressive than I think you fully realize. I don't say that lightly. Naruto's chest swelled with something warm and unfamiliar. A compliment landing in a place inside him that had gone hungry for exactly this kind of recognition for as long as he could remember. Thanks, sensei, he said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything else he'd said in longer than he could remember. That evening, Kakashi made good on his word, presenting himself at the Hokage Tower well after the sun had set, requesting a private audience that Hiruzen granted without hesitation. Already half expecting exactly this conversation given the report he'd received earlier that afternoon regarding a certain unexpected chakra chain incident during a certain bell test. I take it, Hiruzen said, once Kakashi was seated across from him, that today's exercise went rather differently than your previous team assignments. You could say that. Kakashi's expression, visible eye included, had settled into something more serious than his usual lazy demeanor. Hokage-sama, I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with here. Chakra chains and would release together, in a 12-year-old boy, active enough to fully engage a Jonin in genuine combat within his first week of training. That's not a minor development. That's potentially one of the most significant shinobi assets this village has produced in a generation. You are, unfortunately, entirely correct, Hiruzen said, and proceeded to lay out, in careful, measured detail, everything he'd shared with Naruto over the past 2 weeks. The truth of Kushina's hidden Senju lineage, the scroll, the dormant seal, the delicate, careful process of guided training currently underway. Kakashi listened in silence, processing the full scope of what he was being told with the particular stillness of a man who understood, better than most, exactly how much danger this kind of information represented if it fell into the wrong hands. You understand, he said finally, once Hiruzen had finished, that keeping this contained is going to become considerably more difficult the longer Naruto continues actively training and taking missions. Today alone, if either of his teammates had been paying closer attention, or if I'd been a lesser shinobi less capable of maintaining composure under an unexpected engagement, this information could already be halfway across the village. I am aware, Hiruzen said, and something tired crossed his weathered features. Which is precisely why I need you, Kakashi, not simply as Team 7's instructor, but as someone I can trust to help guide Naruto's development with the seriousness and discretion this situation demands. You have experience with unusual and dangerous techniques that few others in this village can match. I would very much value your insight as we determine how best to proceed. Kakashi was quiet for a long moment, weighing the weight of what was being asked of him, not just training a genin team, which was demanding enough on its own, but shepherding the reawakening of 2 of the most significant bloodlines in shinobi history, under circumstances that guaranteed increasingly dangerous attention the moment word inevitably began to spread. I'll do it, he said finally. Though I should mention, Hokage-sama, Team 7's first C-rank mission request just crossed my desk this afternoon. A bridge-building escort out to Wave Country. Ordinarily I'd consider it straightforward enough for a fresh genin team. Given everything you've just told me, I'm no longer quite as confident that assumption holds. Hiruzen's expression sharpened slightly, old instincts honed across decades of leadership already turning the new information over, weighing risks that hadn't existed in quite this shape a mere 2 weeks earlier. Wave country, he repeated slowly. A relatively minor destination, ordinarily. But if word of Naruto's abilities has already begun spreading in even the smallest, most contained ways, then a routine C-rank escort mission might not stay routine for very long, Kakashi finished. The two of them sat with that thought for a long moment, the quiet of the Hokage's office settling heavy around them, both men independently arriving at the same uneasy conclusion, that whatever waited for Team 7 out beyond the safety of Konoha's walls, it might prove considerably more complicated than either of them would have preferred, for a genin team barely a day into its official existence. I'll authorize the mission to proceed as scheduled, Hiruzen said finally. Naruto needs real field experience, and I won't have him treated differently simply because his circumstances have become more complicated. But I intend to assign a discreet ANBU escort to shadow the mission from a distance, unofficially, and without your genin team's knowledge, to avoid unnecessary alarm. Should anything beyond what a standard C-rank mission calls for materialize, I want a safety net already in place. Kakashi nodded slowly, some of the tension in his shoulders easing slightly at the assurance. That seems wise, Hokage-sama. Given everything else we've discussed tonight, I'd rather have more caution than less. On that, Hiruzen said, with the particular weariness of a man who had spent the last 2 weeks recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the future of his village. We are in complete and total agreement. Neither of them had any way of knowing, in that quiet office lit by a single lamp against the darkness outside, just how prescient that caution was about to prove. Because far beyond Konoha's walls, in a small, struggling country connected to the mainland by a single unfinished bridge, a missing nin named Zabuza was already preparing for a job that had nothing to do with genin teams or bloodline secrets. A job that was, nonetheless, about to collide head-on with both. And somewhere in the criminal underworld that connected men like Zabuza to men like the shipping tycoon currently employing him, whispers were already beginning to travel. Quiet, fragmented rumors about a Konoha genin with abilities nobody could quite explain, abilities that sounded, to certain very particular, and very dangerous ears, remarkably like something long thought extinct. But that's a story for next time. The morning Team 7 gathered at Konoha's main gate for their first C-rank mission. The sky hung low and gray, threatening rain that never quite seemed to commit to falling. Naruto arrived early, a habit that was rapidly becoming less of a novelty and more of an actual pattern, much to Sakura's continued, quiet astonishment, bouncing on the balls of his feet with barely contained excitement. A real mission, he announced to no one in particular, slinging his pack higher on his shoulders. Not weeding gardens, not chasing that stupid cat, an actual mission outside the village. Try not to get us killed on your first one, Sasuke said dryly, though there was less bite in it than there might have been a few weeks earlier. Something had shifted in how Sasuke regarded his teammates since the bell test. A wary, watchful curiosity that hadn't fully resolved into anything Sasuke was ready to name, but that had at least replaced his earlier flat dismissal. Hey, I'm not gonna be the one who gets us killed, Naruto shot back. That's gonna be you, tripping over your own hair or something. My hair does not, boys, Sakura interjected, with the particular long-suffering tone of someone already resigned to a long journey. Their client arrived a few minutes later, an older man with a bottle of what he called morning tea clutched in one hand, deep lines etched into a face that seemed permanently arranged around an expression of weary disappointment. Tazuna, the bridge builder, looked the three genin over with obvious skepticism, his gaze lingering longest on Naruto with an expression that suggested he found the boy's orange jacket personally offensive. This is my escort? Tazuna said flatly, taking a long sip from his cup. 3 kids and 1 guy reading a book? I assure you, Kakashi said, not looking up from his novel, we're more capable than we look. Tazuna's grunt suggested he remained thoroughly unconvinced, but there wasn't much room left for negotiation, and so the small group set off down the road leading away from Konoha's gates, Tazuna in the middle, Kakashi trailing at an easy, watchful pace behind, and the 3 genin fanned loosely around their client in the basic formation they drilled the day before. None of them noticed, because they weren't meant to, the faint, near imperceptible presence trailing well behind and above the group's route, an ANBU operative keeping careful Distant watch exactly as Hiruzen had quietly arranged. The first sign that this mission wasn't going to stay simple came a few hours into the journey, when Naruto's foot splashed through a puddle sitting innocently in the middle of an otherwise dry road, a puddle that, as any experienced shinobi would immediately recognize, had no business existing given the complete absence of rain anywhere in the surrounding area for days. Naruto, still new enough to real fieldwork not to catch the significance immediately, didn't think twice about it. Kakashi, walking a few paces behind, most certainly did. They emerged perhaps 30 seconds later, two figures wrapped in a single length of segmented, razor-edged chain, bursting from beneath the water's surface with the speed of trained killers, closing the distance to Kakashi in the space of a heartbeat, and wrapping the chain tight around him before he could so much as raise a hand in defense. One down, one of them Miss-Nin hissed, and the chain constricted violently, tearing Kakashi apart in a spray of blood and water that made Sakura scream and even Sasuke's composure crack for a half-second of raw shock. Except it wasn't blood. It was water. Kakashi's substitution triggering just in time, the real man already reappearing safely behind the two attackers, expression unreadable above his mask. Sasuke, Naruto, engage, Kakashi said calmly, and the two genin, some part of their brief but intensive training already kicking in, moved. Sasuke reacted first, precise and fast, pinning one attacker's chain to a nearby tree with a well-placed shuriken and following up with a decisive kick that sent the man crashing backward dazed. Naruto, meanwhile, found himself facing the second attacker directly, and felt the familiar warm hum building behind his sternum before he'd even consciously decided to call on it. The chains erupted from his back in a flash of gold, lashing out and wrapping tight around the Miss-Nin's arms before the man could react, yanking him clean off his feet and slamming him hard into the packed dirt of the road. A second later, thin roots surged up from beneath the ground, coiling securely around the attacker's limbs, pinning him in place as effectively as any professional restraint jutsu. Silence fell across the road, broken only by the ragged, disbelieving breathing of the two subdued attackers and Tezuna's audible, stunned intake of breath. What? Tezuna managed, staring at Naruto like he just watched the boy sprout a second head. Was that? Family technique, Naruto said, a little breathlessly, trying to sound far more casual about it than he actually felt. His heart was still hammering. This was the first time he'd used the chains against an actual enemy, someone genuinely trying to kill him, and the adrenaline crashing through his system afterward left his hands trembling slightly even as he worked to keep his expression steady. Kakashi crossed to the two subdued attackers, expression grim as he took in their forehead protectors, scratched through, marking them as Miss-Nin, and their distinctive gauntlets. The demon brothers, he said, mostly to himself. Chunin-level Miss-Nin, hired muscle, usually working for someone with considerably deeper pockets than typical bandit work would suggest. He turned a level look on Tezuna, who had gone very pale, his earlier gruff confidence entirely evaporated. I believe, Kakashi said, you have some explaining to do about exactly what kind of C-rank mission this actually is. The full story came out slowly, dragged loose by Kakashi's patient but unyielding questioning as they made camp that evening in a small clearing off the main road. Tezuna's admission that the mission had been dramatically underclassified, that the bridge he was building threatened the stranglehold a shipping tycoon named Gato held over Wave Country's entire economy, and that Gato had both the resources and the ruthlessness to hire increasingly dangerous shinobi to ensure that bridge never got finished. I'm sorry, Tezuna said finally, staring into the small campfire with genuine shame written across his weathered face. I couldn't afford a proper A-rank mission fee. My country doesn't have anything left to pay with. I figured I'd just take the risk myself, and if something happened to me, well, at least I tried. Sakura's expression had softened considerably by the end of the explanation, and even Sasuke's usual guardedness had eased into something more contemplative. Naruto, predictably, was the first to speak. We're not turning back, he said flatly, before Kakashi had even opened his mouth to weigh in on the ethics of continuing a mission that had technically been secured under false pretenses. You've got a whole country depending on that bridge. We're not just gonna walk away because things got a little more dangerous than expected. Naruto, Kakashi started, this decision isn't entirely. I know it's not just up to me, Naruto interrupted, though not disrespectfully, just with the particular stubborn conviction that had, over the past several weeks, become as much a hallmark of his personality as his loud voice or his orange jacket. But come on, Sensei. We can handle this. I know we can. Kakashi studied him for a long moment, weighing the boy's confidence against the very real danger a country under Gato's control apparently represented, a danger that had already escalated to Chunin level. Missing Nin on day 1, with no guarantee it would stop there. We'll discuss it as a team, Kakashi said finally, but I want everyone to understand, if this mission's threat level continues escalating, we may need to make the difficult call to withdraw regardless of how any of us feel about it. Your safety comes before this bridge, Tazuna. I'm sorry, but that's simply the truth of how this has to work. Tazuna nodded slowly, understanding, if not entirely happy about it, and the conversation gradually shifted toward more practical matters. Watch rotations, travel pace, the remaining distance to Wave Country's shores. Sasuke, seated a short distance from the fire, found himself watching Naruto with a particular intensity he hadn't fully examined yet. The chains. The roots. The absolute, unshakable conviction with which Naruto had just argued for continuing a mission that had suddenly become considerably more dangerous than any of them had signed up for. He's not the same person he was a month ago, Sasuke thought, turning the observation over carefully. Something happened to him. Something big. And he's stronger for it, genuinely stronger, not just talk. It wasn't jealousy, exactly, that settled in Sasuke's chest as he watched his teammate across the firelight. It was something closer to recognition. A quiet, private acknowledgement that the boy he'd spent years dismissing as an obnoxious loudmouth chasing a hopeless dream had just fought off a trained killer with techniques that put even some of Sasuke's own clan training to shame. I need to get stronger too, Sasuke thought, jaw tightening slightly. Whatever's happening with him, I can't afford to fall behind. They reached Tazuna's small house in Wave Country the following afternoon, greeted by his daughter Tsunami, a kind-faced woman with dark hair pulled back and dressed in a simple, modest long-sleeved robe suited to the coastal chill, and his young grandson Inari, whose sullen, distant demeanor made an immediate and unfavorable impression on Naruto. What's his deal? Naruto muttered to Sakura, as Inari retreated upstairs without so much as a greeting. Leave him be, Tsunami said gently, overhearing. He's been through a great deal. It's complicated. The days that followed settled into a careful rhythm, Kakashi overseeing training exercises for the genin during daylight hours while also personally supervising security at the bridge construction site. Tazuna continuing his work with visibly renewed hope now that armed protection stood between him and Gato's hard muscle, and the village itself, thin and struggling under years of economic strangulation, slowly beginning to show small, cautious signs of relief at the sight of shinobi actually willing to stand between them and their oppressor. It was during one of those training sessions, deep in a patch of forest a short distance from Tazuna's house, that Kakashi decided it was time to address something that had been sitting unaddressed since the encounter with the demon brothers. Naruto, he said, once Sakura and Sasuke had been set to their own separate chakra control exercises a short distance away. I think it's time we talked more seriously about what you're capable of, and what you're not yet ready for. Naruto's expression sobered slightly. You mean the chains and stuff? I mean the chains and stuff, Kakashi confirmed. You handled that first engagement well, genuinely well, better than I'd have expected from someone with your amount of practical training. But I noticed something during that fight, and I want to make sure you're aware of it too. What? You were reactive, Kakashi said. You called on the chains because the moment demanded it, and your instincts responded correctly. That's a good sign. It means the connection between your intent and your bloodline is developing naturally. But reactive isn't the same as controlled. If we're going to be facing increasingly dangerous opponents on this mission, I need you thinking several steps ahead of your own abilities, not simply reacting to whatever's directly in front of you. Naruto nodded slowly, absorbing that. It wasn't criticism, not really. Kakashi's tone carried the same careful, invested seriousness Hiruzen's had during their own training sessions, and Naruto had learned, over the past several weeks, to recognize the difference between someone tearing him down and someone genuinely trying to help him grow. So what do? We work on precision, Kakashi said. Specifically, I want to see if you can extend a single chain with enough control to hit a target smaller than a person, say, that branch there. He gestured toward a slim, swaying branch some 15 feet away. If you can manage that reliably, it tells me your control has advanced enough to trust in a genuinely dangerous engagement, rather than simply hoping instinct carries you through. For the better part of 2 hours, Naruto worked at exactly that, extending a single chain, over and over, aiming for increasingly small and specific targets, missing more often than not in the early attempts but gradually, steadily narrowing the gap between intention and execution. By the time the sun began sinking low over the tree line, he'd managed to reliably strike the swaying branch 3 times in a row, the chain snapping out with a precision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. Better, Kakashi said, with genuine approval. Much better. We'll keep working on this over the next few days. I have a feeling we're going to need it. Kakashi's instincts, as it turned out, were entirely correct. The confrontation came on the bridge itself, several days later, under a heavy morning mist that clung low over the water and made visibility drop to barely a few dozen feet in any direction. They noticed the workers absent the moment they arrived, the construction site eerily quiet, tools abandoned mid-task, no sign of the usual bustle that had greeted them every previous morning. Tezuna's face had gone gray with dread even before the mist thickened unnaturally around them, well beyond what the morning weather alone could account for. "He's here," Kakashi said quietly, dropping into a ready stance, his visible eye scanning the swirling gray with the focused intensity of a man who had already correctly identified exactly what, or rather, who, they were about to face. "Kakashi of the Sharingan," a voice rasped out of the mist, low and rough, carrying an edge that made even Sasuke's composed expression tighten with real, immediate wariness. "I've been looking forward to this." Zabuza Momochi emerged from the fog like something conjured directly out of nightmare, massive, heavily muscled, a bandaged lower face and an enormous cleaver-like sword resting easy across one shoulder. Exactly the kind of missing nin whose reputation alone was enough to make grown jonin think twice about direct engagement. "Protect the client," Kakashi said quietly, positioning himself between Zabuza and the rest of the group. "This one's mine." What followed was, even accounting for everything Naruto had already witnessed and experienced over the preceding weeks, one of the most genuinely terrifying displays of raw shinobi skill he'd ever seen up close. Kakashi's Sharingan flaring to life beneath his lifted headband, tracking Zabuza's movements with uncanny precision even through a mist thick enough to blind ordinary sight. The two of them exchanging blows and jutsu at a speed that left afterimages hanging in the fog. It was going well, or at least evenly, right up until Zabuza's water clone technique flooded the bridge with a half-dozen duplicates that surrounded Team 7's defensive position from every angle at once, and the real Zabuza slipped through the resulting chaos to trap Kakashi inside a massive, swirling prison of compressed water. "Kakashi-sensei!" Sakura's scream cut through the mist as their instructor, trapped and struggling, found himself unable to break free of the technique without abandoning the water sphere's structural integrity, a trap specifically, cruelly designed to hold him helpless while a water clone dealt with his students at leisure. "Now," Zabuza's clone said, turning toward the 3 genin with a slow, predatory smile visible beneath its bandaged mask, "let's see how well the great copy ninja trained his little brats." Sasuke moved first, engaging the clone with a series of sharp, controlled strikes that showcased exactly why he topped the Academy's rankings for years running: fast, precise, clearly the product of serious clan training. But a water clone, even weakened, still carried a meaningful fraction of the original's overwhelming skill, and it wasn't long before Sasuke found himself pressed hard, defending more than attacking, sweat beading along his brow despite the cool mist surrounding them. "Sakura, stay with Tezuna," Naruto said, and something in his voice, steady, focused, entirely unlike his usual scattered energy, made Sakura nod without argument, positioning herself protectively in front of their client. Naruto moved to Sasuke's side, and for a moment, the two of them fought in a rough, improvised coordination that hadn't been drilled or planned, simply the product of 2 genin who'd spent enough weeks training alongside each other to have developed a rough, instinctive sense of each other's rhythms. "You gonna use those chain things?" Sasuke asked, ducking beneath a wide sweep of Zabuza's massive blade. "Workin' on it," Naruto grunted back, dodging a follow-up strike by inches. "Little busy not dying right now." The opening came a moment later, Zabuza's water clone overextending slightly on a heavy downward strike, momentarily off balance in the split second before it could recover, and Naruto seized it without hesitation. The chains erupted from his back in a burst of gold, lashing out and wrapping tight around the clone's sword arm, yanking hard enough to throw off its entire stance. Sasuke, reading the opening instantly, followed through with a decisive strike that dispersed the clone into a splash of water, the technique collapsing entirely. For a moment, both boys stood there, breathing hard, staring at the puddle where the clone had been, before the sound of Kakashi's water prison shattering drew their attention back toward the main confrontation. The real Zabuza, momentarily distracted by his clone's sudden defeat, had given Kakashi just enough of an opening to break free, but the fight was far from over. A Senbon needle, thrown with pinpoint precision from somewhere in the surrounding mist, struck Zabuza cleanly in the neck a moment later, dropping the massive missing nin to the ground with an abruptness that left everyone, Genin and Jonin alike, staring in stunned confusion. "Thank you for your assistance," said a masked figure, emerging from the mist to crouch beside Zabuza's fallen form. Slight, quick, dressed in a hunter nin's mask and dark, modest tracking gear. "I've been hunting this man for some time. I apologize for taking the kill you were owed." Kakashi's expression remained carefully guarded even as the hunter nin gathered Zabuza's body and vanished back into the mist with a swirl of leaves. "That was strange," Sakura said, once the immediate danger had passed and the group had regrouped, Tazuna safely at the center of their formation. "Very strange," Kakashi agreed, his visible eye narrowed with obvious suspicion. Hunter nin dispose of bodies at the scene, immediately, to prevent secrets from leaking during transport, taking the body elsewhere entirely. He shook his head slowly. "I have a feeling Zabuza Momochi isn't quite as dead as that display was meant to suggest." Kakashi's instincts, as they so often proved to be, were exactly right. The days that followed passed in an uneasy, watchful quiet, Kakashi's assessment of Zabuza's likely survival proving correct in the worst possible way once his own body, still recovering from the strain of the Sharingan and the water prison confrontation, forced him into several days of bed rest that left Team 7 shouldering considerably more of their own training and security responsibilities than any of them would have preferred. It was during one of those days, deep in the forest surrounding Tazuna's house, that Naruto encountered Haku for the first time, a slight, delicate-featured figure gathering medicinal herbs in a simple, modest kimono, whose quiet, gentle demeanor gave absolutely no indication of the lethal skill hiding beneath it. They talked, as strangers sometimes do in the particular unguarded way that comes from not knowing anything about each other's true circumstances, about strength, about purpose, about what it means to have someone precious enough to fight for. Naruto, still riding the emotional aftershocks of his own recent revelations, found himself opening up more than he probably should have to someone he just met, talking about bloodlines and family, and the particular ache of finally understanding where he came from. "You have precious people, then," Haku said quietly, something wistful in the observation. "That's good. That's what makes a person truly strong, not the power itself, but what you choose to protect with it." Naruto didn't learn the truth of who he'd been talking to until several days later, when the final confrontation on the bridge arrived in earnest. Zabuza returned, fully healed and considerably more cautious this time, accompanied by his young companion, and the moment Naruto laid eyes on the delicate, familiar mask covering Haku's face, several pieces clicked into place all at once with sickening clarity. "You're the hunter nin," Naruto said, staring across the mist-shrouded bridge with something between betrayal and confusion tightening his chest. "You're working for him." "I am," Haku said simply, no apology in the admission, only quiet, resigned acceptance. "I'm sorry, Naruto. But I told you already, I'll do anything for the person precious to me." What followed was, by any measure, the single hardest fight Naruto had faced in his short career as a genin, Haku's speed proving nearly impossible to track even with Naruto's improving control, the young shinobi weaving through a series of ice mirror constructs that trapped Sasuke inside a shimmering, deadly prison while Naruto found himself forced onto the defensive more thoroughly than he had been in any engagement since awakening his bloodline. Senbon needles rained down from every angle, each one aimed with surgical precision at joints and pressure points rather than lethal targets. Haku's own reluctance bleeding through even in the middle of active combat, some quiet, buried part of the young shinobi clearly hoping to incapacitate rather than kill the boy they'd spoken with so openly in the forest days before. It wasn't enough to keep Naruto entirely safe, though. A senbon caught him across the shoulder, then another along his ribs, each wound stinging sharp before, to Haku's visible, startled shock, closing over almost as quickly as they'd opened. The Senju regenerative vitality Naruto had inherited working steadily beneath the surface even as the fight raged on. How? Haku breathed, genuine astonishment cutting through the careful composure they'd maintained throughout the engagement. Those wounds should have slowed you considerably. How are you still standing? Guess I'm just stubborn, Naruto said, though the words came out more ragged than he'd intended. Exhaustion and blood loss. However rapidly it was recovering, still taking a genuine toll. Inside the ice mirrors, Sasuke was faring considerably worse. Haku's speed simply too much to fully track even with his own developing Sharingan beginning to flicker to life along the edges of his vision, wounds accumulating faster than his own more ordinary human body could keep pace with. It was watching Sasuke stagger, watching his teammate, his rival, his friend, whatever complicated tangle of both those things they'd become over the past several weeks. Buckle under a barrage he had no way to fully defend against. That something in Naruto finally, decisively snapped past caution and into something rawer. The chains erupted from his back with a force that cracked several of the nearest ice mirrors clean through, and beneath the bridge's wooden planks, roots surged upward with a speed and violence that made even Haku, mid-technique, falter in genuine alarm. Enough, Naruto said, voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there moments earlier. You're not hurting him anymore. What happened next surprised everyone on that bridge, Naruto included. The roots didn't simply restrain. They surged upward through the shattered gaps in the ice mirrors, wrapping tight and secure around Haku's limbs with enough force to hold but not enough to break, a strange, instinctive calibration that Naruto himself couldn't entirely explain even in the moment. Something in him, some deep, buried echo of Hashirama's own legendary restraint, of a man once famous for subduing even-tailed beasts without unnecessary cruelty, guided the technique toward control rather than destruction. Haku, pinned and unable to move, stared at Naruto with wide, startled eyes above the cracked remains of the mask. You could have killed me, Haku said quietly. Why didn't you? Because I don't think you actually want to be doing this, Naruto said, breathing hard, the chains and roots still humming with restrained tension around his captive. You said it yourself. You're doing this for someone precious to you. That's not really about wanting to hurt anybody, is it? Something in Haku's expression cracked, just slightly, grief and exhaustion bleeding through the careful composure that had defined every previous moment of their brief acquaintance. The distraction cost them both, though, because on the other end of the bridge, Kakashi and Zabuza's own confrontation had reached its own critical breaking point. And Gato himself had just arrived with a small army of hired thugs, revealing in a few cold, dismissive sentences that he'd never intended to actually pay Zabuza for his services at all, planning instead to let his missing nin exhaust himself against Konoha's shinobi before disposing of the expensive liability entirely. Something shifted in Zabuza's expression at that betrayal, old, buried loyalty and rage finally breaking through years of mercenary detachment, and in the chaos that followed, Zabuza turned on Gato's forces entirely, cutting a bloody, decisive path through the small army with a fury that made even Kakashi step back and simply let the reckoning unfold. Haku, released from Naruto's restraints in the confusion, moved to stand at Zabuza's side one final time, throwing themselves between their precious person and a lethal strike meant to end the fight. A sacrifice made in the exact way they described to Naruto in the forest days earlier, protecting the person precious to them right up until the very last breath. By the time the dust and blood settled, both Zabuza and Haku lay still on the blood-soaked planks of the unfinished bridge, and Gato's remaining forces, leaderless and thoroughly demoralized, had fled or surrendered entirely, the tycoon's own body left crumpled where Zabuza's final act of vengeance had put him. The bridge was finished a few weeks later, under considerably calmer circumstances, its completion celebrated by a village that had spent years believing such a day would never come. Tazuna, standing at the head of the ceremony with a genuine, unguarded smile that hadn't been present anywhere on his weathered face during the entirety of Team 7's stay, gestured to the newly finished structure with obvious pride. We've decided on a name, he announced to the small gathered crowd. The Great Naruto Bridge, in honor of the boy who taught this whole village what it means to never give up, no matter how impossible the odds looked. Naruto's face went bright red, torn between overwhelming embarrassment and a swelling, genuine pride that he didn't quite have words for, while Sakura and Sasuke exchanged amused looks at his obvious discomfort. As Team 7 finally made their way back down the completed bridge toward the road home, Kakashi fell into step beside Naruto, his expression thoughtful. "You handled Haku's restraint with real judgment back there," Kakashi said quietly. "Restraint over lethal force, even mid-combat, even against someone genuinely trying to hurt your teammate. That's not an easy thing to manage, even for shinobi with considerably more experience than you currently have." "I dunno," Naruto admitted. It felt wrong. Killing them, I mean. They weren't really the enemy." "Not really." "No," Kakashi agreed. "They weren't." He was quiet for a moment, watching Naruto's profile as they walked. "For what it's worth, I think your mother would have made exactly the same choice." Naruto looked over at him, surprised, something warm and tender flickering across his expression at the unexpected mention. "Yeah?" "Yeah," Kakashi said simply, and left it at that, letting the quiet, steady comfort of the statement settle without further elaboration. Behind them, unnoticed by anyone in the small group, the same silent ANBU presence that had shadowed the mission from its very first day peeled quietly away from its concealed position along the tree line, already moving fast and silent back toward Konoha, carrying with it a report that was about to travel considerably further than Hiruzen Sarutobi had ever intended. Because word of a Konoha genin wielding chakra chains and would release together on an active mission had already begun to spread, through Gato's surviving, scattered men, through the small, opportunistic network of information brokers who made their living selling exactly this kind of rumor to the highest bidder, through channels that stretched considerably further than the borders of a small, struggling country called Wave. And in a hidden base somewhere far from Konoha's walls, a pale, serpentine man with sharp golden eyes was about to receive a report that would change the entire trajectory of his ambitions. 3 weeks after Team 7's return from Wave Country, Naruto stood in front of the academy building where his entire shinobi career had begun, staring up at a sign taped hastily to the door redirecting Chunin exam applicants to a room 3 floors up. A sign that, upon closer inspection, was radiating a faint, poorly concealed genjutsu meant to weed out anyone too inexperienced to notice the deception. "Nice try," Naruto muttered, grinning, as he watched a pair of nervous-looking genin from another village hurry past the illusion toward the wrong floor entirely. He wasn't alone in noticing. Beside him, Sasuke's dark eyes had already caught the discrepancy, and further down the hallway, a boy in a green jumpsuit, currently locked in an increasingly public confrontation with none other than Sasuke himself over some perceived slight, had apparently seen through it as well, judging by his pointed, theatrical announcement to the gathered crowd of hopeful genin. "Konoha's handsome devil, Rock Lee, sees through your illusion," the boy declared, striking an exaggerated pose that made half the hallway wince in second-hand embarrassment. "There's no need for such tricks among fellow shinobi," Naruto snorted, already half in love with the sheer, unapologetic energy of this stranger, and made a mental note to introduce himself properly once whatever tension currently simmering between Lee and Sasuke resolved itself. It resolved itself, as these things often did around Team 7, with a fight, brief, one-sided, and deeply humbling for Sasuke, who found himself flat on his back within seconds against a genin whose taijutsu speed put even the Uchiha's considerable natural talent to shame. "You're pretty strong," Naruto said afterward, once Lee's teammates, a stern-eyed girl with buns in her hair and a boy who seemed perpetually exhausted by his own existence, had dragged him off with profuse apologies to a still scowling Sasuke. "Way stronger than you'd think, looking at you." "Thank you?" Lee beamed, entirely unbothered by the ambiguous framing of the compliment. "I train very hard, since I cannot use ninjutsu or genjutsu. Taijutsu is my only path, and so I have dedicated myself to it completely." Something about that struck a chord in Naruto. The idea of someone building genuine, formidable strength out of what should have been a crippling limitation, refusing to let a single missing piece define the whole of what he was capable of. It wasn't so different, in its own way, from 12 years of being told he was worth nothing and choosing, over and over, to believe otherwise anyway. "I like you," Naruto decided. "We should spar sometime. For real, not just some hallway thing." Lee's eyes lit up with genuine delight. "I would be honored, my rival's teammate. Let us make this a promise between fellow shinobi of Konoha." They shook on it, and Naruto filed the promise away with the same fierce sincerity he applied to every commitment he made, entirely unaware that somewhere in the crowded hallway behind them, a pale-skinned genin with an oversized fur-trimmed jacket and a large, ominous gourd strapped to his back had been watching the entire exchange with quiet, calculating interest. Gaara of the Sand said nothing. But his pale, unblinking eyes lingered on Naruto for a long moment before the crowd shifted and swallowed him from view. The written portion of the exam that followed proved to be, as it always was, less a genuine test of academic knowledge and more an elaborate psychological trap designed to weed out anyone who couldn't recognize the true nature of the test itself. And Naruto, who under any ordinary circumstance would have found himself hopelessly, embarrassingly stuck, found the whole affair considerably easier to navigate now that his own confidence had grown roots as deep and steady as the bloodline humming quietly beneath his skin. Not that he cheated, exactly. Ibiki Marino's terrifying, deliberately impossible questions remained just as unanswerable to him as they would have been a month earlier. But he held his nerve through the escalating threats and eliminations around him with a steadiness that surprised even himself. And when the true nature of the test finally revealed itself, that the real challenge had never been the questions at all, but the willingness to make a decision and stand by it under pressure, Naruto found himself, along with the rest of Team 7, comfortably counted among the genin still remaining when Anko Mitarashi burst through the window to announce the next portion of the exam with characteristic theatrical flair. "Welcome," Anko announced, grinning with a fierceness that made several genin visibly pale, "to Training Ground 44. Better known, to those of us who've actually spent time here, as the Forest of Death." The name, Naruto would soon learn, was not remotely an exaggeration. They entered the forest with the scroll of heaven clutched carefully in Sakura's pack, one of two required to advance. A matching earth scroll held by some other team currently hidden somewhere within the dense, oppressive tangle of towering trees and tangled undergrowth stretching out ahead of them. Kakashi had offered a brief, uncharacteristically serious send-off before they entered, reminding all three of them, in a tone that left no room for his usual lazy humor, that this portion of the exam had claimed genin lives before, and that caution mattered more here than almost anywhere else they were likely to be tested. The forest swallowed them within minutes of entering, towering trees blotting out most of the sky, the air thick and humid and carrying strange, distant sounds that Naruto's overactive imagination populated with increasingly elaborate horrors as they pressed deeper toward the central tower. "We need a plan," Sakura said, once they'd found a defensible spot to pause and catch their breath. "We can't just wander around hoping to stumble onto an earth scroll." "That's how people get killed in here," agreed, Sasuke said. "We should set up a temporary position, use it as a base to scout from, and try to identify a team we can realistically take on rather than engaging blind." Naruto, for his part, was quieter than usual, a fact that didn't escape either of his teammates' notice, given how thoroughly out of character prolonged silence had become for him over the past several weeks. "You okay?" Sakura asked. "Yeah, just," Naruto rubbed the back of his neck. "This place feels weird. Like something's watching us." He wasn't wrong. The attack, when it came, arrived with a suddenness that left no room for the careful, deliberate strategy Sasuke had proposed only minutes earlier. 3 shinobi dropped from the canopy above, moving with the coordinated precision of a team that had clearly done this before, closing the distance to Team 7's position before any of the 3 genin could fully process the ambush unfolding around them. Their forehead protectors bore an unfamiliar symbol, a hidden village none of Team 7 immediately recognized, though the sheer aggression and skill radiating off all 3 attackers made their exact origin considerably less important than the immediate problem of survival. "Split up, don't let them box us in." Kakashi's earlier training echoed sharp in Naruto's mind even as instinct took over, and the 3 genin scattered in 3 different directions, breaking the ambush's intended coordination before it could fully close around them. Naruto found himself alone almost immediately, one of the 3 attackers peeling off to pursue him specifically, a lean, quick shinobi wielding twin short blades with a fluid, practiced grace that suggested considerably more experience than a standard genin ought to possess. "You're the one," the attacker said, dark eyes narrowed with focused intent as they circled each other through the dense undergrowth. "The one with the bloodline. We were told to prioritize you specifically." Naruto's stomach dropped. "Told by who?" "Doesn't matter to you," the attacker said, and lunged, What followed was, for Naruto, an uncomfortably close call, the attacker's dual blade style fast and aggressive enough that even his improving reflexes struggled to fully track every angle of assault, forcing him onto the defensive far more than he was accustomed to since his bloodline's awakening had begun reshaping his fighting instincts. He took a shallow cut across his forearm before he managed to create enough distance to properly respond, chains erupting from his back with a snap that made the attacker's eyes widen with something between vindication and genuine alarm. There it is, the attacker breathed, backing up half a step. Just like the report said. Report. The word lodged uncomfortably in Naruto's thoughts even as he pressed his advantage, chains lashing out to force the attacker back on the defensive. Someone had reported on him specifically. Someone beyond the borders of Wave Country had heard enough about what he could do to send a team specifically hunting for him, in the middle of an exam that was supposed to be a straightforward test of skill rather than a targeted assassination attempt. The fight that followed grew increasingly desperate on both sides, the attacker, clearly under orders that didn't permit simple withdrawal, pressing forward with escalating aggression even as Naruto's chains and eventually, a burst of restraining roots began steadily wearing down the gap between them. It ended with the attacker pinned and disarmed, roots coiled tight enough to hold but, per the same instinctive restraint Naruto had shown against Haku weeks earlier, not tight enough to seriously injure. Who sent you? Naruto demanded, breathing hard, adrenaline still hammering through his system. Tell me who wants me specifically. The attacker's expression shuttered closed, some deeply ingrained loyalty or fear overriding whatever willingness to talk might otherwise have existed. Doesn't matter. There'll be others. Word's already out. You think you're the only team in this forest with orders concerning you? A chill worked down Naruto's spine at that, the full implication settling in with uncomfortable clarity. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was, apparently, common enough knowledge among certain circles that multiple parties had already organized specifically around the possibility of encountering him. He didn't have time to process that fully before Sasuke's voice, sharp with urgency, cut through the trees from somewhere nearby. Naruto! Sakura's in trouble. He left the restrained attacker where they lay. Technically a violation of standard procedure, but there wasn't time to weigh that against the far more immediate priority of reaching his teammate, and sprinted through the dense undergrowth toward the sound of Sasuke's voice, chains still humming faintly at his sides, ready to be called on again at a moment's notice. What he found, upon breaking through into a small clearing, made every hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Sakura stood frozen, pale with terror, staring at a massive snake coiled loosely around a section of fallen tree, and beyond the snake, standing with an unhurried, predatory calm that immediately marked them as something far more dangerous than any ordinary Chunin exam proctor or rival genin, was a figure whose pale, elongated features and unnervingly serene expression sent an instinctive wave of dread crashing through Naruto before he even consciously registered why. Ah, the figure said, golden eyes sliding toward Naruto with an interest that felt uncomfortably clinical, uncomfortably like being assessed rather than simply looked at. There he is. I was beginning to wonder if the rumors would prove exaggerated. Who are you? Naruto demanded, positioning himself protectively between the stranger and Sakura, chains already beginning to hum with barely restrained tension. My name isn't important right now, the figure said, a slow, unsettling smile spreading across pale features. What's important is that I've heard the most fascinating things about you, Naruto Uzumaki. Chakra chains. Would release. A bloodline that's supposed to be dead and buried, walking around in a 12-year-old's body. The golden eyes glinted with something hungry, something that made Naruto's skin crawl in a way few things ever had before. I simply had to come see for myself. Sasuke, arriving a half-second behind Naruto, went very still at the sight of the stranger, some instinctive recognition flickering across his expression that Naruto didn't fully understand in the moment. You're not just some random exam proctor. Who are you really? Clever boy, the figure said, though the golden eyes never left Naruto, lingering with an intensity that made Naruto want to physically put himself further between this stranger and everyone else in the clearing. Perhaps another time, we can discuss exactly what makes you interesting too, Sasuke Uchiha. For now though, I find myself considerably more curious about your teammate. The attack, when it came, was fast enough that even Naruto's improving instincts barely registered the movement before the stranger was already directly in front of him, one hand closing around his throat with a grip that felt far stronger than the figure's slight frame should have reasonably allowed. "Let's see," the stranger murmured, close enough now that Naruto could feel breath ghosting cold against his skin. "Exactly how deep this bloodline of yours actually runs." What happened next occurred almost entirely outside Naruto's conscious control. Some instinctive, desperate part of him reacting to the threat with a violence that startled even himself, chains erupting from his back with enough force to physically throw the stranger backward, while roots surged up from the forest floor with a speed and aggression that cracked through packed earth and splintered stone alike. The stranger recovered midair, landing lightly several yards back, and for the first time since the confrontation began, something in that unnervingly calm expression shifted, genuine, visible interest sharpening into something closer to delight. "Fascinating," the stranger breathed, straightening slowly, apparently entirely unbothered by having just been forcibly ejected across a clearing. "Truly fascinating." That response was almost entirely instinctive, wasn't it? Your body defending itself before your conscious mind even fully processed the threat. Do you have any idea how rare that kind of raw, unrefined power potential actually is? "Get away from my team," Naruto said, voice low and dangerous in a way that surprised even him, chains coiling protectively in the air around him and Sakura both. The stranger studied him for a long, considering moment, golden eyes flicking briefly towards Sasuke before settling back on Naruto with renewed, focused interest. "You know," the stranger said conversationally, as though discussing nothing more consequential than the weather, "I came into this forest today with an entirely different agenda in mind. But priorities do have a way of shifting, when something considerably more interesting presents itself unexpectedly." A slow, unsettling smile spread across pale features. "Perhaps I'll simply have to divide my attention between two very promising specimens today, rather than one." The confrontation that followed was, without question, the single most dangerous fight Naruto had ever found himself in, the stranger's speed and raw power operating on an entirely different tier than anything he'd faced before, casually deflecting or avoiding every chain strike and root-based restraint Naruto attempted to bring to bear with an ease that made clear, in the starkest possible terms, exactly how far Naruto still had to go before his bloodline's raw potential translated into genuine mastery. It was only the timely, desperate intervention of an ANBU operative, the same silent presence that had shadowed Team 7's movements since well before Wave Country, breaking cover at last under circumstances that demanded nothing less, that finally forced the stranger to reconsider the engagement's cost-benefit calculus. "Reinforcements," the stranger observed, glancing toward the ANBU's sudden, decisive arrival with mild, almost bemused interest, entirely unbothered by the escalation. How thoughtful of Hiruzen to keep such a close eye on his young protege. The golden eyes flicked back to Naruto one final time, something almost fond, almost hungry, threaded through the assessment. "We'll speak again, Naruto Uzumaki. Count on it." The stranger vanished into the trees with unsettling speed, leaving Team 7 and their ANBU rescuers standing in a clearing scarred by broken earth, splintered wood, and the lingering, cold echo of an encounter none of them fully understood yet. "Who was that?" Sakura managed, voice still shaking with the aftermath of terror. The ANBU operative, mask giving away nothing of the expression beneath it, was quiet for a long moment before answering. "That," the operative said grimly, "was Orochimaru. One of the legendary Sannin, and a missing nin responsible for crimes against this village that I am not authorized to fully disclose. I need to report this encounter to Hokage-sama immediately. All three of you need to proceed to the tower, and remain there under close supervision until this exam concludes." The name meant little to Naruto in the moment, beyond the obvious, unmistakable weight with which the ANBU operative delivered it. But the look on Sasuke's face, pale, tight, some old, half-buried memory clearly stirring behind his dark eyes, suggested that name carried considerably more history than Naruto currently understood. "You know him," Naruto said quietly, once the ANBU had vanished to deliver their report, and the three genin were left alone to process what had just happened. "Don't you?" Sasuke was quiet for a long moment, jaw tight. "My clan's history isn't something I want to discuss right now," he said finally. "Let's just focus on getting through this exam." Naruto let it drop, though the unanswered question settled uneasily alongside everything else this encounter had stirred up. The reality that word of his bloodline had already traveled far enough to draw the attention of one of the most dangerous missing nin in the shinobi world, and that whatever protection Hiruzen's careful, quiet secrecy had once offered was clearly, rapidly eroding. They found their Earth scroll 2 days later, secured through a tense but ultimately successful engagement against a rival team that, thankfully, showed no particular interest in Naruto specifically beyond the standard competitive stakes of the exam itself. A small, welcome relief after the harrowing encounter with Orochimaru. By the time Team 7 finally emerged from the dense, oppressive canopy of the Forest of Death and into the open courtyard surrounding the central tower, all three of them bore the marks of an exam that had demanded considerably more from them than any of them had anticipated going in. Torn clothing, shallow cuts and bruises, and a collective exhaustion that made even Naruto's usually boundless energy flag noticeably. Kakashi met them at the tower's entrance, his single visible eye sharpening with immediate, focused concern the moment he took in their condition. "Report," he said simply, and listened in tense, grim silence as the three genin, trading off details between them, recounted the encounter in the forest, the coordinated attack from an unfamiliar village specifically targeting Naruto, and then, considerably more alarming, the direct confrontation with Orochimaru himself. "You're certain it was him?" Kakashi said, once they'd finished, his tone carrying a weight that made clear exactly how seriously he was taking this information. "The ANBU confirmed it," Sakura said. "Kakashi-sensei, is he really as dangerous as everyone seems to think?" Kakashi was quiet for a long moment, his expression, visible eye included, settling into something grimmer than any of them had seen from him before. "Orochimaru," he said finally, "was once one of this village's most brilliant and celebrated shinobi, a member of the same legendary team as Tsunade and Jiraiya, trained personally by the third Hokage himself. He defected years ago, after certain experiments came to light that this village found impossible to tolerate. Since then, he's been responsible for atrocities across multiple hidden villages, always in pursuit of power, always willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to obtain it." He looked between the three of them, his expression softening slightly with obvious, genuine concern. "If he sought you out specifically, Naruto, that is very serious news, and I intend to make sure Hokage-sama is fully briefed the moment this exam's current portion concludes." Naruto nodded slowly, the weight of the encounter settling more heavily now that the immediate adrenaline had fully faded, replaced by a colder, more persistent unease. "He said we'd talk again," Naruto said quietly. "Like it wasn't even really a threat. Just like a fact." Kakashi's jaw tightened. "Then we make certain that conversation happens on terms considerably more favorable to you than whatever he currently has in mind." That evening, in a quiet meeting held in the Hokage's private office at the tower, hastily arranged the moment word of the encounter reached Hiruzen through both Kakashi's formal report and the ANBU operative's more detailed briefing, the full weight of the situation began to properly crystallize. "This confirms what I had feared since Wave Country," Hiruzen said heavily, seated behind his desk with an expression that carried the particular exhaustion of a man watching a carefully managed situation begin slipping beyond his ability to fully contain it. "Word of Naruto's bloodline has traveled considerably further and faster than I had hoped, and it has now drawn the direct, personal attention of one of the most dangerous individuals currently active in the shinobi world." "What do we do?" Kakashi asked. "Pull him from the remainder of the exam?" Hiruzen was quiet for a long moment, weighing the question with obvious care. "No," he said finally. "Withdrawing him now would accomplish little beyond confirming to Orochimaru, and to anyone else who may be watching, that we consider Naruto too vulnerable to face public scrutiny. That perception alone could invite considerably more aggressive attempts to acquire him by other, less patient parties. I believe, difficult as it is to say, that Naruto's continued participation, properly protected, actually serves his safety better than premature withdrawal would." "With respect, Hokage-sama," Kakashi said, "that calculation puts a 12-year-old directly in danger's path for the sake of appearances." "I am aware," Hiruzen said, and something old and tired crossed his weathered features. "Believe me, Kakashi, I am acutely aware of exactly what I am asking. But I have already increased his ANBU protection considerably beyond what was in place during the Forest of Death portion, and I intend to personally oversee security arrangements for the remainder of this exam far more directly than I would under ordinary circumstances. Naruto will not face this alone. I intend to make certain of that, whatever it requires of me personally. The conversation continued for some time longer, weighing practical security measures against the broader political calculus of what withdrawing or continuing Naruto's participation might signal to a shinobi world increasingly aware that something significant, something historically unprecedented, was currently developing within Konoha's ranks. Naruto himself, waiting outside the office alongside his teammates while the adults debated his fate, caught only fragments of the conversation through the door, enough to understand, in broad strokes, exactly how seriously his situation was now being treated, and exactly how much danger had quietly attached itself to him since that night in the training grounds clearing so many weeks earlier. "You okay?" Sasuke asked quietly, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the three of them. "Yeah," Naruto said, though the word came out less certain than he intended. "I mean, no, not really. But I'll be fine." "I gotta be fine, right? Can't exactly back out of the exam cause some snake guy thinks I'm interesting." "For what it's worth," Sasuke said, after a moment's hesitation that suggested the admission cost him something, "you handled yourself well back there." "Against him, I mean. I've never seen anyone match his speed like that, even briefly." Naruto managed a small, tired smile at that. A genuine compliment from Sasuke Uchiha remained rare enough to be worth noticing, even under circumstances this heavy. "Thanks," he said. "Guess we're both gonna need to get a lot stronger before this is all over, huh?" Sasuke's dark eyes flickered with something complicated. Determination, old grief, the particular hunger of someone who had spent years single-mindedly chasing power for reasons Naruto still didn't fully understand. "Yeah," Sasuke said quietly. "We are." Elsewhere, in a hidden base carved deep into the earth many miles from Konoha's borders, Orochimaru sat in contemplative silence, turning the day's encounter over with the particular careful, patient attention he applied to every piece of information he considered genuinely valuable. "Fascinating," he murmured to the empty room, golden eyes distant with calculation. "Truly, genuinely fascinating." A masked subordinate knelt silently nearby, waiting for whatever instructions might follow. "The Uchiha boy's potential remains considerable," Orochimaru continued, mostly to himself, working through the shifting calculus of his own long-term ambitions. "But Naruto Uzumaki," a slow, hungry smile spread across pale features. "Chakra chains capable of restraining a tailed beast. Would release, thought extinct for generations, manifesting with a raw, instinctive power that even I found genuinely difficult to fully suppress in direct confrontation. Do you have any conception of what such potential represents, properly cultivated, properly refined?" The subordinate said nothing, understanding, as all of Orochimaru's followers eventually learned to understand, that these particular musings required no response beyond attentive silence. "Perhaps," Orochimaru continued, rising slowly and moving toward a bank of dark, cluttered shelves lined with old scrolls and stranger, less identifiable specimens, "my plans for this exam require some modest reconsideration. Sasuke Uchiha remains valuable, certainly. The Sharingan's potential has always held considerable appeal for my research. But a living heir to both the Uzumaki and Senju bloodlines, walking freely through this world, largely unaware of the true scope of his own inherited potential." He trailed off, golden eyes gleaming with something between scientific fascination and genuine, predatory hunger. "That is not an opportunity a man in my position can afford to simply let pass by unclaimed." He turned back to his waiting subordinate, expression settling into something colder, more decisive. "Send word to our contacts within the Sand delegation," Orochimaru said. "The invasion timeline may need adjustment. I find myself increasingly interested in ensuring a particular young Konoha genin survives these exams long enough for our paths to cross again, under circumstances rather more private than a crowded forest allows." The subordinate bowed low and departed to relay the instructions, leaving Orochimaru alone once more with his scrolls, his specimens, and the slow, patient turning of ambitions that had just, quite unexpectedly, acquired an entirely new and considerably more dangerous focal point. Back in Konoha, Entirely unaware of the plans now quietly forming around him in the dark, Naruto Uzumaki finally allowed himself to fall into an exhausted, dreamless sleep in the tower's guest quarters. An ANBU guard stationed discreetly outside his door for the first time in his life. A strange, uneasy kind of comfort, knowing that somewhere close by, someone was watching over him specifically because he mattered enough to protect. It didn't erase the cold unease Orochimaru's parting words had left behind. But it was something, and after 12 years of having so very little, Naruto Uzumaki had learned to hold tightly to whatever small comforts he could find. Tomorrow, the preliminary matches would begin, narrowing this year's crowded field of Chunin exam hopefuls down to the handful who'd advance to the final tournament. And somewhere beyond Konoha's walls, plans were already quietly shifting to make certain that whatever happened in those finals, a particular 12-year-old boy carrying 2 legendary bloodlines in his blood would still be standing at the end of it, one way or another.